Grizzly destroys $85,000 SUV in 6 minutes, March 30th, 2025. The morning of March 30, 2025, dawned crisp and clear over the Teton Range, with temperatures hovering just above freezing at 4:47 a.m., when Eric Thompson first opened his eyes in the luxurious cabin at Jackson Lake Lodge. The 42-year-old investment banker from Seattle had been planning this anniversary trip to Wyoming for months, meticulously researching trails, weather patterns, and wildlife activity reports. His wife Dana, a 38-year-old pediatric surgeon with auburn hair and an infectious laugh, had initially been reluctant to leave her demanding schedule at Seattle Children's Hospital, but Eric had convinced her they needed this time together after the strain of the past year. Eric Michael Thompson had grown up in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, the eldest of 3 children born to Robert and Margaret Thompson. His father, a Boeing engineer, had instilled in him a love of precision and planning that had served him well in his career at Meridian Capital Management, where he specialized in high-risk technology investments. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with graying temples and the lean build of a weekend cyclist, Eric had always been the type of man who read instruction manuals, cover to cover, and maintained detailed spreadsheets for everything from household expenses to hiking equipment. His colleagues often joked that he could plan a military operation with less preparation than he put into a family vacation. Dana Elizabeth Sullivan Thompson had met Eric 7 years earlier at a charity auction in Seattle, where her quick wit and genuine compassion had immediately caught his attention. Born in Minneapolis to Irish Catholic parents, she had excelled academically from an early age, earning her medical degree from Johns Hopkins before completing her pediatric surgery residency at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. At 5 feet 6 inches, with emerald green eyes and a spattering of freckles across her nose, Dana possessed both the gentle bedside manner that put frightened children at ease and the steady hands required for delicate surgical procedures. She had saved countless young lives over her career, but lately the weight of that responsibility had begun to take its toll. The couple had been married for 5 years, and their relationship had weathered its share of storms. Eric's demanding travel schedule and Dana's unpredictable call schedule had created distance between them that both acknowledged but struggled to address. This Wyoming trip was meant to be a reset, a chance to reconnect away from the constant buzz of phones and the pressure of their respective careers. They had specifically chosen Jackson Hole for its reputation as one of America's premier wilderness destinations, where they could experience nature in its most raw and unfiltered form. Their accommodations at Jackson Lake Lodge had cost $450 per night, but Eric had spared no expense for what he hoped would be a transformative experience. The lodge, situated on a bluff overlooking Jackson Lake with panoramic views of the Teton Range, provided the perfect base for their planned hiking adventures. The couple had arrived 3 days earlier on March 27th, spending their first day acclimating to the 6,800-foot elevation and exploring the visitor center at Grand Teton National Park. Dr. Margaret Chen, the lead wildlife biologist at Grand Teton National Park, had been monitoring bear activity in the region for over 15 years. The 51-year-old Harvard-educated scientist had dedicated her career to understanding the complex behavioral patterns of the Yellowstone ecosystem's apex predators. Her research station, located near the park's southern boundary, contained detailed records of every documented bear encounter dating back to 1995. As she reviewed the morning reports on March 30th, Dr. Chen noted with growing concern that GPS collar data from Bear 394, a massive male grizzly known locally as Goliath, showed unusual movement patterns over the past 72 hours. Bear 394 was no ordinary grizzly. At an estimated 650 pounds and standing nearly 9 feet tall on his hind legs, Goliath was one of the largest bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Radio telemetry data, collected over the past 3 years, revealed a highly intelligent and adaptable animal that had learned to associate human activity with food sources. Unlike most bears that avoided human contact, Goliath had demonstrated increasingly bold behavior, approaching campsites and vehicles with an almost calculated curiosity that troubled wildlife experts. Dr. Chen's colleague, Park Ranger Thomas Mitchell, a 29-year-old former Marine with a degree in wildlife management from Colorado State University, had been tracking Goliath's movements since emerging from hibernation in early March. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with the bearing of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, Mitchell had spent 4 years in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian life and finding purpose in wilderness conservation. His military training had given him skills that proved invaluable in the backcountry, but nothing had prepared him for the complexity of managing human-wildlife interactions in one of America's most visited national parks. The weather forecast for March 30th called for partly cloudy skies, with temperatures reaching a high of 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Light winds from the southwest at 8 to 12 miles per hour would create ideal hiking conditions. Though meteorologist Sarah Rodriguez at the National Weather Service office in Riverton noted the possibility of isolated afternoon thunderstorms developing along the Teton Range. Rodriguez, a 33-year-old atmospheric scientist with a master's degree from Penn State, had been monitoring the region's weather patterns for 6 years and understood how rapidly conditions could change in the mountains. At 6:15 a.m., Eric and Dana began their morning routine, sharing coffee and reviewing their planned hiking route on the detailed topographic maps spread across their cabin's dining table. Their destination was the Hidden Falls Trail, a moderately challenging 5.2-mile round-trip hike that would take them through diverse terrain along the shores of Jackson Lake, before climbing 840 feet in elevation to reach the spectacular 200-foot waterfall that gave the trail its name. Eric had chosen this particular route after extensive research on online hiking forums and consultation with the lodge's concierge, James Morrison, a 45-year-old former park ranger who had intimate knowledge of every trail in the region. Morrison, a weathered outdoorsman with silver-streaked hair and arms marked by decades of manual labor, had worked in various capacities throughout the greater Yellowstone region for over 20 years. His experience included stints as a backcountry guide, search and rescue coordinator, and wildlife technician before settling into his current role at the lodge. Morrison had survived 3 bear encounters during his career, including a terrifying incident in 1998 when a female grizzly with cubs had stalked his research team for over 6 hours through the Yellowstone backcountry. The experience had left him with a deep respect for these apex predators and an almost supernatural ability to read the subtle signs of their presence in the wilderness. When Eric and Dana approached Morrison at 7:30 a.m. to confirm their hiking plans, he noticed immediately that they were well equipped, but perhaps overly confident. Their gear was top of the line. Eric wore a $300 Patagonia jacket and carried a $250 Osprey backpack loaded with emergency supplies, while Dana sported high-end Salomon hiking boots and a GPS device that had cost more than most people's monthly car payments. Morrison appreciated their preparation, but sensed they might lack the wilderness experience to recognize potential dangers before they became life-threatening situations. Folks, I need to make sure you understand that we've had increased bear activity in the area you're planning to visit, Morrison explained, his weathered hands tracing their intended route on a laminated trail map. Bear 394, we call him Goliath, has been active in the Jackson Lake area for the past week. He's a big male, very intelligent, and he's not particularly afraid of people. I strongly recommend you consider the Jenny Lake Trail instead. It's equally beautiful, but sees more foot traffic, which tends to keep the bears away. Eric, Ever the confident decision-maker waved off Morrison's concerns with the casual dismissal of someone accustomed to managing risk in financial markets. "We appreciate the warning, but we've done our research. We have bear spray, we know how to make noise, and we'll be careful about food storage. Besides, the chance of actually encountering a bear is statistically negligible, right?" Morrison's expression darkened slightly as he studied the young couple. In his 2 decades of wilderness experience, he had learned to recognize the type of well-meaning but potentially dangerous overconfidence that Eric was displaying. "Sir, I respect your preparation, but statistics don't mean much when you're face-to-face with 650 pounds of apex predator. These aren't the black bears you might encounter in the Cascades near Seattle. Grizzlies are fundamentally different animals. They're stronger, more aggressive, and significantly more unpredictable." Dinah, with her medical training's emphasis on evidence-based decision-making, found herself caught between her husband's determination and Morrison's obvious expertise. Her surgical experience had taught her to listen carefully to warnings from experienced colleagues, and something in Morrison's demeanor suggested this wasn't routine cautionary advice. "What specifically has this bear been doing that concerns you?" she asked, her analytical mind seeking concrete data to inform their decision. Morrison pulled out a thick folder containing incident reports and GPS tracking data. Bear 394 first appeared on our radar 3 years ago when he was involved in multiple campground incidents in Yellowstone. Since then, he's been documented approaching vehicles, investigating campsites, and showing unusually bold behavior around humans. Last week, he spent 6 hours investigating an empty campsite at Coulter Bay, methodically tearing apart a picnic table and storage locker. The behavior suggests he's learned to associate human activity with food rewards. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer from National Geographic who'd been documenting bear behavior in the region for the past month. Walsh, a petite woman with sun-streaked blonde hair and the lean build of someone who spent months in remote wilderness locations, had been tracking Goliath for her upcoming article on human-wildlife conflict in America's national parks. Her Canon 5D Mark IV camera, equipped with a telephoto lens worth more than most people's cars, had captured over 2,000 images of various bears throughout the ecosystem. "Excuse me," Walsh interjected, having overheard Morrison's conversation with the Thompsons. "Are you planning to hike in the Jackson Lake area today? I've been photographing Bear 394 for the past 3 weeks, and his behavior has become increasingly concerning. Yesterday afternoon, I observed him following a family with children for over 2 miles before park rangers were able to intervene and escort the family to safety." Eric's confidence began to waver slightly as he absorbed this new information. His investment background had taught him to gather multiple data points before making important decisions, and the consistency of warnings from these experienced professionals suggested genuine cause for concern. However, his personality also included a stubborn streak that had served him well in high-pressure business negotiations, but could prove dangerous in wilderness situations. "Look, I appreciate everyone's concern," Eric said, his voice carrying a slight edge of irritation. "But Dana and I have been planning this trip for months. We're experienced hikers, we have all the proper equipment, and we're not going to let the remote possibility of a bear encounter keep us from experiencing one of America's most beautiful wilderness areas. We'll be careful, we'll make noise, and we'll be back before dark." Morrison exchanged a meaningful glance with Walsh, both recognizing the futility of arguing with someone whose mind was already made up. In their combined 40 years of wilderness experience, they had encountered numerous visitors who arrived with more gear than experience and an unwavering belief that proper equipment could substitute for wilderness wisdom. Most of these encounters ended without incident, but both had also witnessed the tragic consequences when overconfidence met unpredictable nature. "At minimum," Morrison said, pulling a satellite communicator from behind the concierge desk, "please take this Garmin InReach device. It will allow you to send emergency messages even in areas without cell coverage. The rental fee is $50, and it could save your lives if something goes wrong." Dana, whose medical training had instilled a deep appreciation for backup safety measures, immediately reached for her purse. "That's an excellent idea. We'll take it." She handed Morrison a credit card while shooting Eric a look that clearly communicated this wasn't optional. As the couple prepared to depart, Walsh made one final attempt to dissuade them. "I understand your desire to experience the wilderness, but please consider that my photography work has shown me behaviors in Bear 394 that I've never documented in other grizzlies. He's not just bold, he's calculated. Yesterday, I watched him systematically investigate 6 different vehicle locations in the Coulter Bay parking area, testing door handles and examining windows with what appeared to be deliberate problem-solving behavior." The description sent a chill down Dana's spine, but Eric had already made his decision and was unwilling to appear indecisive in front of strangers. "We appreciate the warnings, and we'll be extra cautious. But we're going to proceed with our planned hike. We've come too far to turn back now." At 8:45 a.m., Eric and Dana loaded their gear into their pristine Toyota Land Cruiser, an $85,000 vehicle that Eric had purchased 6 months earlier specifically for adventures like this. The metallic grey SUV represented the latest in automotive technology, with advanced safety features, all-wheel drive capability, and enough ground clearance to handle the roughest backcountry roads. Eric had spent hours researching the perfect adventure vehicle, reading reviews and comparing specifications with the same obsessive attention to detail he applied to investment analysis. The Land Cruiser's interior featured premium leather seats, a state-of-the-art navigation system, and a premium sound system that Eric had used to play Dana's favorite classical music during their drive from Seattle. The vehicle's cargo area contained everything they might need for their hiking adventure: a high-end first aid kit, emergency supplies, extra food and water, camping chairs, and even a portable espresso machine that Dana had insisted on bringing despite Eric's protests about unnecessary weight. As they departed Jackson Lake Lodge at 9:10 a.m., the couple felt the familiar excitement that came with venturing into unknown territory. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Teton Range, creating a dramatic backdrop that seemed to promise adventure and natural beauty beyond anything they had experienced in their urban lives. Eric drove with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling his environment, while Dana used her phone to capture photos of the stunning scenery that unfolded around every curve of the mountain road. The drive to the Hidden Falls trailhead took 43 minutes along winding mountain roads that climbed steadily through dense forests of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. Eric navigated carefully, his investment banker's risk management instincts making him cautious despite his eagerness to begin their adventure. The Land Cruiser's advanced traction control system handled the occasionally rough pavement with ease, and its heated seats kept the couple comfortable as they gained elevation and the outside temperature dropped. At 9:53 a.m., they arrived at the Hidden Falls trailhead parking area, a gravel lot that could accommodate roughly 30 vehicles. Only 6 other cars were present, suggesting they would have relatively solitary hiking experience that both craved after their demanding professional lives. Eric carefully parked the Land Cruiser in a spot that would provide easy access for their return, while ensuring the vehicle wouldn't block other hikers' access to the trail. The trailhead featured a wooden kiosk containing maps, emergency contact information, and current wildlife activity reports. A prominently displayed sign warned hikers about recent bear activity in the area and provided detailed instructions for proper behavior in the event of an encounter. Dana read the sign carefully, her medical training making her naturally attentive to safety protocols, while Eric busied himself with final gear checks and GPS calibration. "Listen to this," Dana said, reading aloud from the wildlife warning. Bear 394, a large male grizzly, has been active in this area. This bear has shown unusually bold behavior around humans and vehicles. Hikers are advised to travel in groups, make noise while hiking, carry bear spray, and report any bear sightings immediately to park authorities. She looked at Eric with concern. "Maybe we should reconsider this trail." Eric, who had already committed significant time and mental energy to this specific hiking plan, remained determined to proceed. "Dana, we've taken every reasonable precaution. We have bear spray, we'll make noise, and we'll stick together. These warnings are probably just standard legal disclaimers to protect the Park Service from liability. The actual probability of encountering this specific bear is essentially zero." At 10:15 a.m., the couple began their hike on the Hidden Falls Trail, a well-maintained path that initially followed the shoreline of Jackson Lake through relatively open terrain. The trail surface consisted of packed dirt with occasional rocky sections, and wooden bridges crossed several small streams that flowed down from the mountains toward the lake. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and the sound of water lapping against the rocky shoreline. For the first 1.8 miles, the hike proceeded exactly as Eric had envisioned. The couple maintained a steady pace, stopping frequently to photograph the spectacular mountain scenery and observe wildlife through their high-end binoculars. They spotted several elk grazing in distant meadows, a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, and numerous smaller birds that Dana identified using a field guide she had brought from Seattle. The physical exercise felt therapeutic after months of sedentary professional work, and both began to relax into the rhythm of wilderness travel. At 11:30 a.m., they reached the point where the trail began its ascent toward Hidden Falls, leaving the lakeshore and climbing through increasingly dense forest. The character of the hike changed dramatically as they gained elevation, with the open vistas giving way to closed canopy forest that created a more intimate but also more claustrophobic environment. The trail became steeper and more challenging, requiring careful footing on loose rocks and exposed roots. Dana's surgical fitness served her well on the climbing sections, but Eric, despite his weekend cycling routine, found himself breathing heavily in the thin mountain air. They paused frequently for water breaks and to consult their GPS device, which showed they had completed approximately 60% of their planned route. The forest around them was eerily quiet, with none of the bird activity they had observed during the first portion of their hike. Unknown to the hiking couple, Bear 394 had been tracking their scent for the past 37 minutes. The massive grizzly's keen sense of smell, approximately 2,100 times more sensitive than a human's, had detected their presence from over a mile away. Goliath possessed the patience and intelligence that had allowed him to survive and thrive in one of North America's most challenging ecosystems for over 12 years. And he had learned that humans often carried or left behind food items that were far more calorie-dense than his typical diet of roots, berries, and small mammals. Dr. Jen's research had documented Goliath's extraordinary problem-solving abilities, including his capacity to open complex food storage containers and his learned behavior of investigating vehicles for potential food sources. Trail camera footage from the previous month had captured him spending over an hour manipulating the door handle of a park maintenance vehicle, eventually succeeding in opening the cab and consuming a worker's forgotten lunch. This behavior represented a dangerous evolution in human-bear interaction that had significant implications for visitor safety. At 12:15 p.m., Eric and Dana reached Hidden Falls, the spectacular 200-foot cascade that tumbled down a sheer rock face into a crystal-clear pool surrounded by moss-covered boulders. The sight was everything Eric had hoped for and more, a pristine wilderness experience that seemed untouched by human presence. They spent 45 minutes at the falls, eating lunch, taking photographs, and simply absorbing the profound beauty of their surroundings. Dana's lunch consisted of a carefully planned combination of trail mix, energy bars, and fresh fruit that she had researched for optimal hiking nutrition. Eric had packed a more elaborate meal, including gourmet sandwiches from a Seattle deli, and imported cheese that had cost more per pound than most people spent on groceries in a week. They shared their food while sitting on a flat boulder beside the pool, their conversation ranging from work stress to future travel plans to their growing appreciation for experiences that money couldn't replicate. "I'm really glad we decided to do this," Dana admitted, her earlier concerns about bear activity temporarily forgotten in the beauty of their surroundings. "When was the last time we spent an entire day without checking email or thinking about work? This is exactly what we needed." Eric felt a deep satisfaction at hearing his wife's contentment. His careful planning and research had produced the experience he had envisioned, and their relationship felt stronger than it had in months. "I was thinking we should make this an annual tradition. Maybe next year we could try some of the more challenging trails in Glacier National Park or the North Cascades." At 1 p.m., they began their descent back toward the trailhead, following the same route they had taken during their ascent. The return journey felt easier despite their tired legs, as they were now familiar with the trail's challenges and could anticipate the difficult sections. Their conversation was relaxed and optimistic, focusing on future adventures and their renewed appreciation for spending unstructured time together. The couple made good time on their descent, reaching the junction with the Lakeshore Trail at 2:20 p.m. They paused here for a final water break and to take additional photographs of Jackson Lake, which looked different from this perspective than it had during their morning approach. The afternoon light created new patterns on the water's surface, and the surrounding mountains appeared to glow with an almost supernatural intensity. It was during this rest stop that Dana first noticed something that would later seem significant in retrospect. "Eric, do you hear that?" she asked, tilting her head to listen more carefully to their surroundings. "Hear what?" Eric replied, focused on adjusting his camera settings to capture the changing light conditions. "That's exactly what I mean. I don't hear anything. No birds, no insects, nothing. It's too quiet." Dana's medical training had made her sensitive to subtle environmental changes that might indicate danger, and the sudden absence of background forest sounds triggered an unconscious alarm response. Eric paused his photography to listen more carefully. Dana was right. The forest around them had become unnaturally silent, as if every living creature had suddenly gone into hiding. In his focus on navigation and photography, he had failed to notice this change, but once Dana pointed it out, the silence felt almost oppressive. "Maybe it's just the time of day," Eric suggested, though he felt less confident than he sounded. "Don't birds and animals have different activity patterns? We probably just missed the peak activity hours." At 2:35 p.m., they resumed their hike toward the parking area, now only 1.8 miles from their vehicle. The final section of trail followed the lakeshore through relatively open terrain that would normally feel safe and reassuring, but the continued absence of wildlife activity created an underlying tension that both felt but neither wanted to acknowledge. They walked more quickly than they had during the morning, driven by an unconscious desire to reach the security of their vehicle and begin the drive back to the lodge. Bear 394 had been paralleling their route for the past 47 minutes, moving through the dense forest with the silent efficiency that had made grizzlies apex predators for millennia. His massive size, 650 pounds, and standing nearly 5 feet tall at the shoulder while on all fours, belied his ability to move through the wilderness with almost ghost-like stealth. Decades of evolution had perfected his ability to approach potential food sources without detection, and his intelligence allowed him to anticipate human movement patterns based on his extensive experience with hikers and campers. The bear's behavior during this stalking phase represented a significant deviation from typical grizzly patterns, as documented in Dr. Chen's research. Most bears avoided human contact and would retreat when they detected human presence from a distance. Goliath's willingness to actively track and follow humans suggested a dangerous conditioning that had developed through years of successful food acquisition from human sources. This learned behavior was precisely what wildlife experts feared most, as it indicated a bear that no longer viewed humans as threats to be avoided, but rather as opportunities to be investigated. At 3:10 p.m., Eric and Dana emerged from the forest into the parking area where they had left their Land Cruiser approximately 5 hours earlier. The relief they felt at reaching their vehicle was immediately replaced by shock and horror as they took in the scene before them. Their pristine $85,000 SUV had been transformed into a barely recognizable mass of twisted metal, shattered glass, and scattered debris that extended across a 20-foot radius around the parking space. "Oh my God," Dana whispered, her medical training providing no framework for processing the destruction she was witnessing. "What happened to our car?" Eric stood frozen in disbelief, his mind struggling to reconcile the pristine vehicle they had left that morning with the apocalyptic wreckage now occupying their parking space. Every window had been shattered, with safety glass covering the ground like crystalline snow. The driver's side door hung at an impossible angle, its hinges twisted beyond recognition. Deep claw marks scored the paint from hood to rear bumper, and the front grille had been completely destroyed, leaving twisted metal and plastic components scattered across the gravel. The Land Cruiser's roof showed evidence of massive impact damage, with dents that suggested something enormously heavy had climbed onto the vehicle and used its weight to cause structural damage. The sunroof had been completely destroyed, creating a gaping hole that exposed the devastated interior. Their expensive camping gear, which had been neatly organized in the cargo area that morning, was now strewn across the parking lot in various states of destruction. "This had to be Bear 394, Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Nothing else could cause this kind of damage, but why? Why would a bear do this to a vehicle? Dana's analytical mind began cataloging the destruction with clinical detachment, a coping mechanism she had developed during her medical training when confronted with traumatic injuries. Look at the pattern of the damage. It's not random destruction. It looks systematic, like the bear was investigating the vehicle for something specific. See how the doors have been torn open rather than just damaged. And look at the interior. The SUV's leather interior had been completely shredded, with stuffing from the seats scattered like snow throughout the parking area. The dashboard had been destroyed, with electronic components torn out and scattered. Most disturbing of all, their cooler, which had contained snacks and drinks for the drive back to Seattle, had been completely emptied, with its contents consumed or scattered across the ground. He was looking for food, Eric realized, his investment background helping him recognize patterns even in this chaotic situation. That's why Morrison and the others were so concerned about this specific bear. He's learned that vehicles contain food, and he's developed the ability to access them. As they stood surveying the wreckage, both began to realize the full implications of their situation. They were stranded in a remote wilderness area with no immediate means of transportation or communication. Their cell phones showed no signal, and the nearest ranger station was over 20 miles away. The satellite communicator that Morrison had insisted they rent was in Eric's backpack, but the reality of needing to use it for an actual emergency was overwhelming. "We need to call for help," Dana said, her medical training making her focus on immediate practical needs rather than the emotional impact of their situation. "Do you remember how to use that satellite device?" Eric fumbled through his backpack with shaking hands, retrieving the Garmin InReach communicator that suddenly seemed like the most important piece of equipment they owned. The device's simple interface allowed users to send preset emergency messages to search and rescue authorities, but Eric's stress was making it difficult to remember the brief instructions Morrison had provided that morning. "I think I pressed this button for emergency services," Eric said, his finger hovering over the red SOS button that would instantly alert rescue authorities to their location and situation. "But once I press this, there's no taking it back. This becomes an official emergency response situation." "Eric, look around," Dana replied, gesturing at the destruction surrounding them. "This is already an emergency situation. We're stranded in bear country with a dangerous animal that has demonstrated it's not afraid of humans. We need professional help, and we need it now." At 3:18 p.m., Eric activated the emergency beacon, sending a distress signal that would be received by emergency coordinators at the Teton County Sheriff's Office and Grand Teton National Park. The message included their exact GPS coordinates, the nature of their emergency, and their current status. Within minutes, their signal would trigger a coordinated response involving multiple agencies and dozens of trained professionals. The couple's immediate priority was ensuring their own safety while waiting for rescue. The bear that had destroyed their vehicle could still be in the area, and their presence at the site of his successful food acquisition might trigger additional aggressive behavior. Wildlife experts understood that bears often returned to locations where they had previously found food, and the Thompsons' presence could be interpreted as competition for resources. "We need to get away from the vehicle," Dana said, her medical training making her think systematically about risk assessment. "If the bear comes back and finds us here, he might see us as threats to his food source. We should move to that open area near the trailhead where we'll have better visibility and multiple escape routes." Eric agreed with his wife's logic, but leaving the vicinity of their destroyed vehicle felt like abandoning their last connection to civilization. The wreckage represented not just their means of transportation, but also their equipment, supplies, and sense of security. Moving away from it required accepting that they were now dependent on others for their survival, a profound psychological shift for two successful professionals accustomed to controlling their own circumstances. As they gathered their essential gear and prepared to move to a safer location, Eric noticed additional details about the attack that hadn't been immediately obvious. The bear's claws had left deep gouges in the vehicle's metal surfaces, scratches that were over an inch deep and nearly 2 feet long. The pattern suggested an animal of extraordinary size and strength, confirming their suspicions about Bear 394's identity. "Look at this," Eric said, pointing to a section of the driver's door where the metal had been peeled back like aluminum foil. "The force required to cause this kind of damage is almost incomprehensible. We're talking about an animal that weighs as much as 3 large men and has claws that can tear through steel." Dana examined the damage with the analytical eye of someone trained to assess trauma. "The claw marks are consistent with what I've read about grizzly bear capabilities. Their claws can grow up to 4 inches long and are powered by muscles that can generate tremendous force. But what's unusual is the systematic nature of this destruction. Most animal attacks on vehicles are brief and focused on immediate food access. This looks like the bear spent considerable time methodically investigating every possible entry point." Their analysis was interrupted by a sound that froze both of them in place. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps moving through the forest toward their location. The approaching sounds were rhythmic and deliberate, suggesting a large animal moving with purpose rather than the random movement of smaller wildlife. Both Eric and Dana felt their heart's rate increase as they realized the bear might be returning to the scene of his successful vehicle raid. "Don't move," Dana whispered, remembering the bear safety instructions they had reviewed that morning. "If it's the bear, sudden movement might trigger a charge. We need to make ourselves appear large and back away slowly." The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sound of breaking branches and disturbed vegetation that indicated an animal of considerable size. Eric's hand moved instinctively toward the bear spray attached to his belt, though he struggled to remember the proper deployment technique in his current state of stress. The canister suddenly felt inadequate protection against an animal that had just demonstrated its ability to destroy a vehicle that weighed over 5,000 pounds. At 3:24 p.m., Bear 394 emerged from the tree line at the edge of the parking area, his massive form confirming every warning they had received that morning. The grizzly stood nearly 5 feet tall at the shoulder, with a distinctive silver-tipped coat that identified him unmistakably as the bear known to researchers as Goliath. His head was enormous, easily the size of a large dog, and his eyes showed an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. The bear paused at the edge of the clearing, apparently assessing the situation with the calculated patience that had made him such a successful survivor. His nose worked constantly, sampling the air for scents that would provide information about potential threats or opportunities. For nearly 30 seconds, human and bear regarded each other across the parking area, each trying to determine the other's intentions. Eric later estimated that Goliath weighed at least 650 pounds, though his thick spring coat made him appear even larger. The bear's front paws were the size of dinner plates, and his claws gleamed black in the afternoon sunlight. Most intimidating of all was his obvious lack of fear. Unlike the bears they had seen in wildlife documentaries, Goliath showed no inclination to retreat or avoid human contact. "He's not afraid of us," Dana whispered, her voice barely audible. "Every bear safety article I've read says they usually try to avoid humans. This one is treating us like we're just another part of his environment." The bear began moving toward their destroyed vehicle, apparently intent on continuing his investigation of potential food sources. His movement was fluid and purposeful, demonstrating the deceptive speed that made grizzlies so dangerous despite their massive size. Research had shown that bears could reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour in short bursts, faster than any human could run even under ideal conditions. As Goliath approached the wreckage of their Land Cruiser, Eric and Dana began backing slowly toward the trailhead information kiosk, hoping to put distance between themselves and the bear without triggering a defensive response. Their movement was careful and deliberate, avoiding sudden gestures that might be interpreted as threatening. Every step felt like a small victory, each foot of distance potentially crucial for their survival. The bear reached their vehicle and immediately began investigating areas he had not thoroughly explored during his initial attack. His behavior suggested familiarity with human scents and equipment, as he focused his attention on areas where food was typically stored rather than randomly investigating all surfaces. This learned behavior was precisely what made him so dangerous. He had developed a systematic approach to exploiting human resources. "He's done this before," Eric observed, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Look how methodically he's searching. He knows exactly where to look for food in vehicles. This isn't opportunistic behavior, it's learned hunting strategy." Goliath spent several minutes investigating the cargo area, using his powerful claws to tear apart sections of the interior that had survived his initial assault. The sound of metal being torn and plastic components being crushed created an acoustic backdrop that emphasized the futility of their expensive vehicle against natural forces. Every dollar they had spent on safety features and advanced engineering proved meaningless against 650 pounds of determined apex predator. At 3:31 p.m., the bear apparently satisfied himself that no additional food sources remained in the vehicle and turned his attention to the surrounding area. His keen sense of smell immediately detected the human scents that Eric and Dana were leaving as they slowly retreated, and his head swiveled toward their location with predatory focus. For the first time since emerging from the forest, Goliath appeared to regard the humans as subjects worthy of direct investigation. "He's looking at us," Dana said, her medical training helping her maintain clinical observation even in this terrifying situation. "His body language has changed. Before he was focused on the vehicle. Now we have his attention." The bear began moving in their direction with the fluid, purposeful gait that had carried him through decades of wilderness survival. His movement was neither rushed nor hesitant. He approached with the confidence of an animal that had never encountered a situation he couldn't handle through size, strength, or intelligence. Each step brought him closer to two humans who were beginning to realize that their hiking experience had become a life-or-death survival situation. Eric's hand closed around the bear spray canister on his belt, though deploying it would require the bear to come within 30 feet of their position. The spray was effective only at close range and depended on favorable wind conditions to avoid contaminating the user. In their current situation, with afternoon breezes swirling unpredictably through the parking area, the spray represented an uncertain defense at best. "If he charges," Eric said quietly, "we use the spray when he gets to about 20 feet. Then we back away slowly and try to make ourselves look as large as possible. If that doesn't work..." He didn't finish the sentence, unable to articulate the reality of what a physical encounter with a 650-pound grizzly would mean for their survival. Dana's surgical experience had exposed her to traumatic injuries that most people never witnessed. But nothing in her medical training had prepared her for the possibility of becoming a victim herself. The bear approaching them possessed the physical capability to inflict trauma that would be instantly fatal, and their distance from medical facilities meant that even survivable injuries could prove lethal due to delayed treatment. Goliath continued his approach, closing the distance between them with measured steps that suggested calculation rather than aggression. His behavior differed from typical bear charges, which were usually explosive bursts of speed designed to eliminate threats quickly. Instead, he seemed to be studying them, perhaps trying to determine whether they represented competition for food sources or potential threats to his territory. "Maybe he's just curious," Dana suggested, though her voice carried little conviction. "Some of the research I read suggested that bears investigate new stimuli to determine if they're threats or opportunities. He might just want to understand what we are." Eric found little comfort in this possibility, as bear curiosity often involved physical investigation that humans rarely survived. The bear's size and strength meant that even casual contact could prove catastrophic, and his lack of fear suggested he had no inhibitions about approaching closely enough to satisfy his curiosity through direct examination. At 3:36 p.m., when Goliath had closed to within 50 feet of their position, the first helicopter appeared over the tree line at the edge of the parking area. The aircraft belonged to the Teton County Sheriff's Office Search and Rescue Unit, which had been dispatched immediately upon receiving Eric's emergency beacon signal. The helicopter's arrival represented the beginning of a coordinated rescue operation that would eventually involve dozens of professionals and multiple agencies. The helicopter's rotor noise had an immediate and dramatic effect on the bear's behavior. Goliath had encountered aircraft before during his years in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and while he wasn't particularly afraid of them, he recognized them as indicators of increased human activity. His predatory focus shifted from the hiking couple to the approaching aircraft, buying Eric and Dana precious time to increase their distance from his position. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, the helicopter pilot, was a 15-year veteran of search and rescue operations who had participated in over 200 wilderness emergencies during her career. Her first priority was assessing the situation and determining the safest approach for evacuating the stranded hikers without creating additional dangers. The presence of a large grizzly bear complicated the rescue operation significantly, as it required coordination with wildlife management authorities and careful consideration of approach routes that wouldn't endanger either the victims or the rescue team. Teton Base, this is Rescue 1. Rodriguez radioed to the coordination center. We have visual on 2 subjects in the Hidden Falls parking area. Large bear present, approximately 50 meters from subjects. Vehicle appears to be completely destroyed. Requesting immediate response from bear management team and additional ground units. The emergency response system for incidents involving dangerous wildlife had been refined through decades of experience in the greater Yellowstone region. Dr. Chen and Ranger Mitchell were already en route to the location, bringing specialized equipment for managing bear encounters and the expertise needed to assess Goliath's behavior and intentions. Their arrival would provide crucial support for the rescue operation while ensuring the bear's safety and future management. From her position in the aircraft, Rodriguez could see the extent of damage to the Thompson's vehicle and immediately understood why the emergency beacon had been activated. The systematic destruction suggested an encounter with one of the region's larger bears, and the methodical nature of the damage indicated an animal with significant experience exploiting human resources. This information would be crucial for wildlife managers planning their response to the incident. Subjects appear uninjured, but are maintaining distance from large grizzly. Rodriguez continued her radio report. Bear is showing interest in aircraft, but does not appear immediately aggressive towards subjects, requesting guidance on approach protocol, given wildlife presence. The coordination center patched Rodriguez through to Dr. Chen, whose expertise in bear behavior made her the primary authority for managing the wildlife aspects of the rescue operation. Chen's knowledge of Bear 394's specific behavioral patterns would be essential for predicting his likely responses to the rescue attempt and minimizing the risk of creating a more dangerous situation. Lieutenant Rodriguez, this is Dr. Chen with Park Wildlife Management, came the radio response. The bear you're observing is Bear 394, known as Goliath. He's a large male with unusual tolerance for human presence. I strongly advise against close approach with the aircraft until we can deploy hazing techniques to encourage him to leave the area. We're 15 minutes out with specialized equipment. Rodriguez acknowledged the guidance while maintaining her position at a safe distance from the parking area. Her experience with wildlife encounters had taught her that helicopter rotor wash could trigger unpredictable responses from large animals, potentially creating more dangerous situations for people on the ground. The safest approach would be to wait for wildlife experts to clear the area before attempting to land or deploy rescue personnel. Meanwhile, Eric and Dana had reached the relative safety of the Trailhead Information Kiosk, which provided them with a sturdy structure for protection and multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated further. The bears' attention remained focused on the helicopter, giving them the opportunity to assess their options and prepare for whatever happened next. At least help is coming, Dana said, her medical training helping her focus on positive developments rather than dwelling on their continued danger. That pilot knows we're here, and she's probably coordinating with ground units to get us out safely. Eric felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety as he watched the standoff between the helicopter and the bear. While rescue was clearly underway, their situation remained precarious as long as Goliath remained in the area. The bear's size and demonstrated capability for violence meant that any miscalculation during the rescue attempt could prove catastrophic. "I just keep thinking about all the warnings we received this morning," Eric admitted. "Morrison, Walsh, even the signs at the trailhead. Everyone tried to tell us this bear was different, more dangerous than typical wildlife. We should have listened." Dana took her husband's hand, feeling the tremor of adrenaline and stress that they both were experiencing. "We made the best decision we could with the information we had. Yes, we probably should have been more cautious, but we can't change that now. We need to focus on getting through this safely." At 3:42 p.m., a second helicopter arrived. This one carrying Dr. Chen and Ranger Mitchell, along with specialized equipment for managing dangerous wildlife encounters. The aircraft maintained a careful distance from Bear 394, while the wildlife experts assessed his behavior and planned their intervention strategy. Their approach would need to balance human safety with wildlife protection protocols that governed all activities within the national park system. Dr. Chen observed Goliath through binoculars, noting behavioral cues that would inform their management strategy. The bear's relaxed posture and methodical investigation of his surroundings suggested he was not in an agitated state, which would make hazing techniques more likely to succeed. However, his obvious lack of fear around human activity meant that conventional deterrent methods might prove ineffective. "He's displaying classic food-conditioned behavior," Dr. Chen radioed to the Rescue Coordination Center. "His association of human activity with food rewards has overcome his natural wariness. We'll need to use enhanced hazing techniques, possibly including rubber bullets and noisemakers, to encourage him to leave the area." Ranger Mitchell prepared the specialized equipment they would need to safely clear the bear from the area while ensuring his long-term survival. The goal was not to harm Goliath, but rather to reinforce natural behavioral patterns that would keep him away from human activity. This delicate balance between human safety and wildlife protection represented one of the most challenging aspects of managing large predators in heavily visited wilderness areas. The wildlife management team's strategy involved creating a coordinated series of stimuli designed to make the parking area less attractive to the bear, while providing clear exit routes that would allow him to retreat without feeling cornered. Bears that felt trapped or threatened were significantly more likely to display aggressive behavior, potentially creating life-threatening situations for everyone involved. "We'll approach from the west side of the clearing," Dr. Chen explained to Mitchell and the helicopter pilot. "I want to give him a clear retreat route toward the forest, while making this location unpleasant enough that he'll choose to leave voluntarily. The key is patience. We can't rush this process without risking everyone's safety." At 3:48 p.m., the wildlife management team began their intervention, using a combination of noisemakers, rubber bullets fired into the ground near the bear, and helicopter positioning to encourage Goliath to leave the area. The bear's initial response was alert interest rather than fear, confirming Dr. Chen's assessment that conventional deterrent methods might be less effective with this particular animal. Goliath stood to his full height on his hind legs, an impressive display that made him appear even larger and more formidable. From this position, he surveyed the increasing human activity around him with what appeared to be calculated assessment rather than panic. His behavior suggested an animal that was weighing his options rather than simply reacting to perceived threats. "He's not responding to our initial hazing attempts," Dr. Chen reported. "This level of habituation to human presence is extremely concerning from a long-term management perspective. We may need to escalate our deterrent methods." The escalation involved more aggressive noisemakers and closer helicopter approaches designed to create enough disturbance that the bear would choose to retreat rather than continue investigating the area. However, this more intensive approach also carried increased risks, as a stressed or cornered bear might respond with aggressive behavior toward the nearest targets, Eric and Dana. Eric watched the wildlife management operation with fascination and terror, realizing that their rescue depended on successfully convincing a 650-pound apex predator to voluntarily leave an area where he had just achieved a significant food acquisition success. The bear's intelligence and learned behavior patterns were now working against human efforts to manage the situation safely. "It's like watching a chess match between humans and nature," Eric observed to Dana. "Except the stakes are our lives, and our opponent weighs more than both of us combined and has 4-inch claws." Dana's medical perspective provided a different framework for understanding their situation. "What strikes me is how calculated his behavior is. Most animals operate primarily on instinct, but this bear is clearly learning and adapting. That makes him more dangerous, but also potentially more predictable if the wildlife experts understand his patterns." At 3:54 p.m., Dr. Chen made the decision to deploy rubber bullets directly toward the bear, rather than firing warning shots into the ground. This represented a significant escalation in their hazing efforts and carried the risk of provoking an aggressive response. But Goliath's continued presence near the stranded hikers made more aggressive intervention necessary. The first rubber bullet struck the bear in the shoulder, causing him to drop to all fours and spin toward the source of the impact. For a moment, Dr. Chen feared they had triggered exactly the aggressive response they were trying to avoid, but Goliath's reaction was more puzzled than angry. He appeared to be processing this new type of stimulus and determining how to respond. "Target acquired the impact but is not showing immediate retreat behavior," Mitchell radioed, preparing for follow-up deterrent measures. The second rubber bullet struck near the bear's rear paws, finally producing the desired response. Goliath turned away from the parking area and began moving toward the forest, though his pace was deliberate rather than panicked. His retreat suggested a calculated decision rather than fear-driven flight, which was concerning from a long-term management perspective, but provided the immediate opening rescue teams needed. "Bear is moving away from subjects toward the tree line," Dr. Chen reported, maintaining hazing pressure to ensure complete withdrawal from the area. Lieutenant Rodriguez immediately repositioned her helicopter to begin the extraction process, while Dr. Chen and Mitchell continued their efforts to keep Goliath moving away from the parking area. The rescue window might be brief, as the bear's lack of strong fear response suggested he might return once the immediate pressure was removed. "Rescue 1 to subjects," Rodriguez announced through her aircraft's external speakers. "Prepare for immediate extraction. Move to the center of the parking area, away from any vegetation where the bear might approach unseen." Eric and Dana quickly gathered their essential gear and moved to the designated pickup area, their relief at the prospect of rescue tempered by the knowledge that Goliath was still nearby. The bear had disappeared into the forest, but could emerge at any time, particularly if the helicopter noise and human activity triggered his curiosity rather than continuing to deter him. The helicopter landing created a whirlwind of dust and debris from the gravel parking area, adding another layer of chaos to an already complex situation. Rodriguez's skill as a pilot was evident in her ability to maintain precise control while dealing with challenging wind conditions created by the surrounding forest and mountainous terrain. "Move quickly, but don't run," came the radio instruction as the aircraft touched down. Running movements might trigger the bear to return and investigate. Eric and Dana approached the helicopter with rapid but controlled movements, their survival now dependent on reaching the aircraft before Goliath's curiosity overcame the temporary deterrent effects of the hazing operation. Every second felt crucial as they covered the 50 feet between their position and the helicopter's open door. At 4:03 p.m., both hikers were aboard the rescue helicopter and lifting off from the Hidden Falls parking area, leaving behind the wreckage of their vehicle and their first direct encounter with one of North America's most formidable predators. The relief they felt was overwhelming, but both understood that their ordeal was far from over. They would need medical evaluation, debriefing with multiple agencies, and psychological support to process the trauma of their experience. From the air, the destruction of their Land Cruiser appeared even more comprehensive than it had seemed from ground level. The Bear's attack had been systematic and thorough, leaving virtually nothing of value intact. The vehicle that had represented security and adventure that morning was now merely an expensive monument to the power of wild nature over human technology. "That was Bear 394, Dr. Chen's voice came through their headphones as the helicopter gained altitude. "You're extremely fortunate that he was more interested in your vehicle than in you personally. His behavior today represents a significant escalation in his interactions with human property that will require immediate management action. The flight to St. John's Medical Center in Jackson took 18 minutes, during which Eric and Dana began to process the magnitude of their experience. They had survived a close encounter with one of the most dangerous animals in North America and witnessed firsthand the destructive capability that made grizzly bears apex predators. Their expensive outdoor gear and careful planning had proved irrelevant against natural forces that operated by fundamentally different rules than those governing their professional lives. "We were completely out of our element," Eric admitted to Dana as Jackson Hole Valley spread out below them. "All our equipment, all our research, all our preparation meant nothing when faced with a real wilderness emergency. We survived because of luck and the skill of people who understand this environment better than we ever will." Dana squeezed her husband's hand, feeling gratitude for their survival mixed with a new appreciation for the expertise required to work safely in wilderness environments. "I keep thinking about Morrison's warnings this morning. He knew exactly what could happen, and we dismissed his concerns because we thought technology and money could substitute for experience." Dr. Rachel Morrison, the emergency room physician who met them at St. John's Medical Center, was a 41-year-old trauma specialist who had treated dozens of bear attack victims during her 8 years in Jackson Hole. Her experience with wilderness injuries had taught her that psychological trauma often proved more challenging to treat than physical injuries, particularly for victims who had never previously confronted their own mortality in such a direct way. "Physically, you both appear to be in excellent condition," Dr. Morrison reported after completing her initial examination. "No signs of injury, normal vital signs, and good hydration despite your stress. Psychologically, however, you've experienced significant trauma that will require attention and support." The psychological impact of their encounter became more apparent as Eric and Dana began relating their experience to hospital staff and park officials. Both displayed classic signs of acute stress reaction, including hypervigilance, difficulty concentrating, and intrusive thoughts about what might have happened if circumstances had been different. Their survival had depended on factors largely beyond their control, a realization that challenged their fundamental assumptions about personal agency and security. Sheriff Brad Hansen, a 23-year veteran of law enforcement in Teton County, arrived at the hospital at 5:30 p.m. to conduct the official incident report that would be required for insurance claims and wildlife management decisions. Hansen had investigated over 40 bear encounters during his career, but the systematic destruction of the Thompsons' vehicle represented one of the most comprehensive examples of property damage he had documented. Bear 394 has been escalating his interactions with human property over the past 3 years, Hansen explained as he recorded their account of the incident. This attack represents a significant development in his behavioral patterns that will require immediate action from wildlife management authorities. Your experience provides crucial data for understanding how his behavior is evolving. The sheriff's investigation would become part of a comprehensive case file that would influence important decisions about Goliath's future management. Bears that demonstrated persistent property damage and loss of natural wariness around humans often faced relocation or, in extreme cases, euthanasia to protect public safety. The documentation of their encounter would contribute to these life and death decisions about wildlife management. "What happens to the bear now?" Dana asked, her medical ethics creating concern for the animal's welfare despite her recent terror. "I understand he's dangerous, but he's also just following his natural instincts to find food sources." Sheriff Hanson's expression grew serious as he considered the implications of Goliath's behavior. "That decision will be made by wildlife experts based on his complete behavioral history and the risk he poses to public safety. Bears that lose their natural fear of humans and develop systematic approaches to exploiting human resources rarely return to normal wild behavior patterns." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jennifer Walsh, the National Geographic photographer who had warned them about Bear 394 that morning. Walsh's documentation of the bear's behavior over the past month would provide crucial context for understanding how his interactions with humans had escalated to the point of systematic vehicle destruction. "I'm so relieved you're both safe," Walsh said as she entered their hospital room. "I've been tracking Goliath's behavior for weeks, and what happened to your vehicle represents exactly the kind of escalation I've been documenting. His problem-solving abilities and lack of human wariness make him one of the most dangerous bears I've ever observed." Walsh's photographic evidence showed a clear progression in Bear 394's interactions with human property, from cautious investigation to bold exploitation of food sources. Her images documented his learning process as he developed more effective techniques for accessing vehicles and campsites, behavior that culminated in the systematic destruction of the Land Cruiser. "The most concerning aspect of his behavior is the calculated nature of his approaches," Walsh explained, showing them photographs on her camera's display screen. "Most bears that get into human food sources do so opportunistically. Goliath actively seeks out human activity and has developed sophisticated strategies for exploiting our resources." At 6:45 p.m., Dr. Chen arrived at the hospital to conduct a detailed debriefing about their encounter with Bear 394. Her research required comprehensive documentation of every human interaction with the bear to understand his behavioral patterns and assess the risk he posed to future visitors. The Thompsons' experience represented one of the most significant incidents in Goliath's documented history. "I need you to walk me through every detail of your encounter," Dr. Chen requested, settling into a chair beside their hospital beds. "The timing of his approach, his body language, his investigation of your vehicle, and his response to our hazing efforts. Every detail helps us understand how his behavior is evolving." Eric and Dana spent over an hour providing detailed accounts of their experience, from the first signs of unusual forest silence to their rescue by helicopter. Dr. Chen took extensive notes while recording their conversation for future analysis, understanding that their observations might provide crucial insights for protecting other visitors to the region. "Your description of his systematic investigation of your vehicle is particularly valuable," Dr. Chen commented. "Most bears would have fled when they heard the helicopter approaching, but Goliath's continued focus on potential food sources suggests a level of conditioning that's extremely concerning from a public safety perspective." The debriefing process helped Eric and Dana begin processing their experience from an analytical rather than purely emotional perspective. Understanding the scientific context of their encounter provided a framework for comprehending what had happened to them and why their situation had been genuinely life-threatening rather than simply frightening. "We were incredibly fortunate that he was more interested in our vehicle than in us personally," Eric realized as they discussed the bear's behavior patterns. If he had identified us as potential threats to his food source or territorial competitors, the outcome could have been very different. Dr. Chen nodded gravely at Eric's observation. Bear 394's tolerance for human presence is what makes him so dangerous. Most bears would have fled when they detected your scent near their food acquisition site. His willingness to investigate while you were present suggests he no longer views humans as significant threats. At 8:20 p.m., James Morrison arrived at the hospital with insurance paperwork and replacement transportation arrangements for the stranded couple. Morrison's expression carried a mixture of relief at their safety and frustration that his warnings had proved prophetic in such a dramatic way. His decades of wilderness experience had taught him to recognize potentially dangerous situations, and the Thompsons' dismissal of his concerns had troubled him throughout the day. "I'm genuinely relieved you're both safe," Morrison said as he helped them complete the necessary paperwork for their insurance claim. "When I heard about the emergency beacon activation and bear involvement, I feared the worst. Vehicle destruction is one thing. Human casualties are something else entirely." The insurance evaluation of their destroyed Land Cruiser would ultimately total $78,000 in damages, making it one of the most expensive wildlife-related vehicle losses in Wyoming history. The comprehensive nature of the destruction meant that virtually no components could be salvaged, requiring complete replacement rather than repair. Their adventure vehicle had become a total loss in less than 6 hours. "The good news is that your insurance policy includes comprehensive coverage for wildlife damage," Morrison explained as they reviewed the paperwork. "The bad news is that you'll need alternative transportation back to Seattle, and rental agencies don't typically have vehicles available on short notice during peak season." Morrison had arranged for a rental SUV to be delivered to the hospital the following morning, allowing Eric and Dana to begin their drive home once they were medically cleared for travel. The vehicle was significantly less luxurious than their destroyed Land Cruiser, but it would provide reliable transportation back to their normal lives in Seattle. "I keep thinking about what you said this morning about Bear 394 being different from other bears," Dana reflected as they completed the insurance paperwork. "Your warnings weren't just standard safety disclaimers. You were trying to protect us from a specific and documented threat." Morrison appreciated Dana's recognition of his expertise, though he took no satisfaction in being proved correct about the danger. 20 years of wilderness work teaches you to recognize genuine threats versus routine precautions. Goliath represents a category of wildlife danger that most visitors never encounter, but the consequences of that encounter can be catastrophic. The conversation was interrupted by a phone call from Dr. Chen, who had returned to her research station to analyze GPS tracking data from Bear 394. Her preliminary findings revealed disturbing patterns in the bear's movement that had significant implications for visitor safety and wildlife management decisions. "Goliath returned to the vehicle destruction site within 45 minutes of your rescue," Dr. Chen reported. "He spent over 2 hours investigating the area, apparently searching for additional food sources. This behavior confirms that he views human activity sites as reliable resource locations." The news that Bear 394 had returned so quickly to the scene of his successful food acquisition reinforced the severity of the situation they had escaped. If their rescue had been delayed, or if mechanical problems had forced them to remain in the area longer, they would have encountered an emboldened bear that had been reinforced in his association of human presence with food rewards. "What's our next step regarding the bear?" Eric asked, his investment background making him think in terms of risk management and future planning. "Are there measures being taken to prevent similar incidents with other visitors?" Dr. Chen's response carried the weight of difficult decisions that balanced human safety against wildlife conservation priorities. Bear 394's behavior has reached a level that requires immediate management action. We'll be meeting tomorrow to determine whether relocation or other measures are necessary to protect public safety. At 9:30 p.m., Eric and Dana were cleared for release from the hospital with instructions for follow-up care and psychological support resources. Their physical condition was excellent, but Dr. Morrison emphasized that psychological trauma from life-threatening experiences often manifested days or weeks after the initial incident. Professional counseling would be essential for processing their experience and preventing long-term psychological complications. What you experienced today was genuine life-threatening trauma, Dr. Morrison explained as she provided them with discharge instructions. Many people who survive bear encounters develop post-traumatic stress symptoms that require professional treatment. Don't hesitate to seek help if you experience nightmares, intrusive thoughts, or anxiety about outdoor activities. The couple returned to their cabin at Jackson Lake Lodge at 10:15 p.m., exhausted by the emotional and physical demands of their ordeal. Their room, which had seemed like a luxury accommodation that morning, now felt like a sanctuary from the dangers they had discovered in the wilderness. The contrast between their morning optimism and evening trauma was almost impossible to process. "I don't think I'll ever look at wilderness areas the same way," Dana admitted as they prepared for bed. "This morning, I thought nature was something we could experience safely, with proper equipment and planning. Now I understand that we're always guests in an environment that operates by rules we don't fully comprehend." Eric found himself repeatedly checking the locks on their cabin doors and windows, rational behavior that nevertheless reflected the hypervigilance that often followed traumatic experiences. His confidence in his ability to plan and control outcomes had been fundamentally shaken by their encounter with forces that couldn't be managed through research and preparation. The bear spray we carried probably wouldn't have made any difference if he had decided to attack us directly, Eric realized as he reviewed the day's events. We were completely dependent on his choice to focus on our vehicle rather than us personally. That's a level of powerlessness I've never experienced. March 31st, 2025. Began with a 6 a.m. phone call from Dr. Chen with urgent news about Bear 394's continued activity. GPS tracking data showed that Goliath had remained in the Hidden Falls area throughout the night, an unprecedented behavior pattern that suggested his association with the location had been strongly reinforced by his successful vehicle raid. He's established what we call a resource site at the location where he destroyed your vehicle, Dr. Chen explained during the phone conversation. This behavior indicates he expects to find additional food sources there and will likely return repeatedly. We're implementing immediate area closure and preparing for enhanced management action. The area closure meant that the Hidden Falls Trail would be closed to all public access until wildlife managers could address the bear situation. This decision affected dozens of planned hiking trips and represented a significant disruption to recreational activities in one of the park's most popular destinations. Their encounter with Bear 394 had consequences that extended far beyond their personal experience. We're also recommending that all overnight accommodations in the area implement enhanced food storage protocols and bear safety briefings for guests, Dr. Chen continued. Goliath's demonstrated ability to exploit human resources makes him a persistent threat to anyone staying in the region. At 7:30 a.m., Eric and Dana met with Park Superintendent Michael Rodriguez to discuss the broader implications of their experience and the Park Service's response to the incident. Rodriguez, a career Park Service professional with over 25 years of experience managing complex wilderness areas, understood that their encounter represented a critical decision point for wildlife management in the region. Bear 394's behavior has reached a threshold that requires decisive action, Rodriguez explained as they reviewed incident reports from his office. Our primary responsibility is protecting visitor safety while maintaining the ecological integrity of this ecosystem. Unfortunately, those goals sometimes conflict when dealing with problem wildlife. The superintendent's office overlooked Jackson Lake and the Teton Range, providing a stunning backdrop for discussions about the challenges of managing human-wildlife interactions in one of America's most visited wilderness areas. The beautiful scenery served as a reminder of what drew millions of people to experience wild places, while also illustrating the complex management challenges these visits created. "What are the options for managing a bear like Goliath?" Dana asked, her medical ethics making her concerned about the welfare of the animal that had traumatized them. "Are there alternatives to lethal management that might address the safety concerns?" Rodriguez appreciated Dana's concern for wildlife welfare, though his expression suggested the options were limited. Relocation is possible, but rarely successful with food-conditioned bears. They typically return to familiar territory or develop similar problem behaviors in new locations. Enhanced hazing might temporarily modify his behavior, but his demonstrated intelligence suggests he would likely adapt to whatever deterrent measures we implement. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of wildlife technician Marcus Thompson, a 26-year-old recent graduate from the University of Montana's wildlife program who had been assigned to monitor Bear 394's movements through the night. Thompson's exhausted appearance reflected the intensity of tracking a dangerous bear through wilderness terrain in darkness. Bear 394 remained at the vehicle destruction site until approximately 3 a.m., Thompson reported. He then moved to Coulter Bay Campground, where he investigated 6 unoccupied campsites before returning to the Hidden Falls area. This pattern suggests he's actively searching for human food sources throughout his territory. The report confirmed wildlife managers' worst fears about Goliath's behavior. He was actively seeking human contact rather than avoiding it, and his search patterns indicated sophisticated understanding of where food might be available. This level of food conditioning represented one of the most challenging situations for wildlife management professionals. His movement pattern last night covered over 12 miles of park territory, Thompson continued. He's systematically investigating every location where he's previously encountered human activity. This behavior goes far beyond opportunistic scavenging. He's developed a comprehensive foraging strategy based on human resources. At 9 a.m., the wildlife management team held an emergency meeting to determine Bear 394's fate. The meeting included Dr. Chen, Ranger Mitchell, Superintendent Rodriguez, and representatives from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department who had authority over wildlife management decisions within the park. Eric and Dana were invited to participate as the victims whose experience had precipitated the crisis. Based on the documentation we've gathered over the past 3 years, Bear 394 represents an unacceptable risk to public safety. Dr. Chen began the meeting with a comprehensive review of Goliath's behavioral history, his systematic exploitation of human resources, lack of natural wariness, and demonstrated ability to cause significant property damage make him unsuitable for continued management in areas with human activity. The decision facing the wildlife management team was whether to attempt relocation to a remote area where human contact would be minimal, or to authorize lethal management to eliminate the threat permanently. Both options carried significant ethical and practical complications that required careful consideration of scientific evidence and management precedents. Relocation would require helicopter transport to the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana, over 200 miles from any significant human activity. Ranger Mitchell explained the relocation option. However, GPS tracking data from previous bear relocations shows that adult males often attempt to return to familiar territory, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles over dangerous terrain. The relocation option also required cooperation from Montana wildlife authorities and careful monitoring to ensure the bear didn't develop similar problem behaviors in his new location. The cost of helicopter transport, GPS collar maintenance, and long-term monitoring would exceed $50,000, resources that could alternatively be used for preventing similar problems with other bears. The alternative is lethal management, which would permanently eliminate the threat, but also remove a genetically valuable individual from the ecosystem, Dr. Chen continued. As difficult as this decision is, our primary responsibility must be protecting human safety while maintaining the overall health of the bear population. Eric found himself in the unexpected position of participating in decisions about the life or death of an animal that had terrified him less than 24 hours earlier. His business background had involved difficult decisions with financial consequences, but never choices that would determine whether a living creature survived or died. I understand the safety concerns, but is there any possibility of enhanced management that might allow him to remain in the ecosystem? Eric asked, surprising himself with his concern for the bear's welfare. Could increased monitoring or behavioral modification techniques address the problem without relocation or lethal management? Dr. Chen appreciated Eric's concern, but explained the limitations of behavioral modification techniques with food-conditioned bears. Adult grizzlies that have developed systematic approaches to exploiting human resources rarely abandon those behaviors voluntarily. Enhanced hazing might temporarily suppress the behavior, but the underlying conditioning typically persists and often resurfaces during periods of natural food scarcity. The discussion continued for over 2 hours as wildlife experts reviewed every available option for managing Bear 394's dangerous behavior. Their analysis considered scientific literature from similar cases, resource constraints, legal requirements, and ethical obligations to both wildlife conservation and human safety. The complexity of the decision reflected the challenges facing wildlife managers throughout North America as human development encroached on wilderness habitats. At 11:30 a.m., the wildlife management team reached their decision through a formal vote that considered all available evidence and management options. The unanimous conclusion was that Bear 394's behavior had reached a level that required lethal management to protect public safety, with the understanding that this decision represented a failure of the human systems designed to prevent such situations from developing. Bear 394 will be located and removed from the ecosystem within the next 48 hours. Superintendent Rodriguez announced the decision to Eric and Dana. This outcome represents a tragic failure on multiple levels, but our primary responsibility must be protecting the safety of the millions of people who visit this area annually. The decision to authorize lethal management of Bear 394 would be implemented by specialized wildlife personnel using techniques designed to minimize stress and ensure quick, humane death. The bear's remains would be used for scientific research and educational purposes, ensuring that his death contributed to better understanding of human-wildlife conflict and prevention strategies. Eric and Dana learned that their encounter with Bear 394 had been his final interaction with humans. The destruction of their vehicle had provided the conclusive evidence wildlife managers needed to authorize lethal management, making them unwitting participants in the chain of events that would end the bear's life. This knowledge added another layer of complexity to their emotional processing of the traumatic experience. I feel terrible that our experience contributed to his death sentence, Dana admitted as they prepared to leave Jackson Hole. I understand the safety rationale, But there's something tragic about an animal being killed for following his natural instincts to find food. Dr. Chen provided context that helped Eric and Dana understand their role in a much larger pattern of human-wildlife conflict. Bear 394's conditioning developed over several years through multiple interactions with human food sources. Your encounter was simply the final incident in a long history of problematic behavior. His fate was determined by his cumulative actions, not by your specific experience. At 1 p.m. on March 31st, Eric and Dana began their drive back to Seattle in their rental vehicle, leaving behind the scenic beauty of Jackson Hole and carrying memories that would influence their relationship with wilderness areas for the rest of their lives. Their anniversary trip had become a transformative experience that challenged their assumptions about nature, safety, and their own capabilities in unfamiliar environments. The drive home provided time for reflection and initial processing of their traumatic experience. Both struggled with conflicting emotions about their survival, the bear's fate, and their future relationship with outdoor recreation. Their expensive gear and careful planning had proved irrelevant when confronted with genuine wilderness dangers. A humbling realization for two successful professionals accustomed to controlling their circumstances. I keep thinking about how different our lives would be if the bear had been more interested in us than in our vehicle, Eric reflected as they drove through Idaho. We survived because of factors completely beyond our control. That's a level of randomness and vulnerability I've never experienced before. Dana's medical training provided a framework for understanding trauma and recovery, but experiencing life-threatening danger personally was fundamentally different from treating trauma patients professionally. Her clinical knowledge about post-traumatic stress couldn't prevent her own emotional responses to intrusive memories and heightened anxiety about future risks. The news media had begun covering their story by the time they reached Boise, with reports focusing on the dramatic vehicle destruction and the bear's subsequent fate. Their experience became part of a larger narrative about human-wildlife conflict and the challenges of managing dangerous animals in popular wilderness areas. The coverage was generally sympathetic, but also emphasized the broader implications of their encounter for wildlife management policies. Local couple's $85,000 vehicle destroyed by grizzly bear in Wyoming National Park, read the headline in the Seattle Times. The incident highlights growing concerns about aggressive bear behavior in popular wilderness destinations and raises questions about visitor safety protocols. The media attention was unwelcome for Eric and Dana, who preferred to process their experience privately rather than having it become a subject of public discussion. However, their story served an important educational purpose by illustrating the real risks that existed in wilderness areas and the expertise required to manage those risks safely. By the time they reached Seattle on April 1st, Eric and Dana had begun the long process of integrating their traumatic experience into their understanding of themselves and their relationship with the natural world. Their anniversary trip had ended with their marriage stronger than before, but their confidence in outdoor recreation fundamentally changed. "I don't think I'm ready to go hiking again anytime soon," Dana admitted as they unpacked their gear in their Seattle home. "Every sound in the forest will remind me of that moment when we realized the bear was stalking us. Maybe that fear will fade with time, but right now it feels overwhelming." Eric found himself researching bear attack statistics and wilderness safety protocols with the obsessive attention to detail he usually reserved for investment analysis. Knowledge felt like a way to regain some sense of control over an experience that had demonstrated his complete powerlessness in the face of natural forces. Their follow-up appointment with a trauma counselor was scheduled for April 3rd, as recommended by the hospital staff in Jackson Hole. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in wilderness trauma, explained that their reactions were normal responses to a genuinely life-threatening experience that would require time and professional support to process fully. Surviving a close encounter with a large predator represents one of humanity's most primal fears, Dr. Williams explained during their first session. Your nervous systems are responding appropriately to a situation that activated every survival instinct you possess. Recovery involves gradually re-establishing your sense of safety while integrating the reality of what you experienced. The psychological impact of their encounter extended beyond simple fear to fundamental questions about risk assessment, personal capability, and their place in ecosystems they didn't fully understand. Their expensive gear and careful planning had created an illusion of control that was shattered by confrontation with genuinely wild nature operating according to its own rules. The hardest part is accepting how little control we actually had, Eric acknowledged during their counseling session. I spent months planning every detail of this trip, researching equipment and routes and safety protocols. None of that preparation mattered when we encountered a 650-pound apex predator that had learned to exploit human resources. Dr. Williams helped them understand that their survival had involved a combination of good decisions, proper equipment, and fortunate circumstances that they couldn't have entirely controlled. Their careful planning had positioned them to respond effectively when emergency arose, even though it couldn't prevent the emergency from occurring. The insurance settlement for their destroyed Land Cruiser was finalized in early May, providing funds to replace their vehicle, but not the sense of security that had been lost with it. Eric found himself researching armored vehicles and other extreme protective measures before recognizing that these were anxiety responses rather than rational safety planning. The bear didn't care how much our vehicle cost or how many safety features it had, Dana observed as they shopped for a replacement. All that technology was meaningless when confronted with an animal that weighs more than the vehicle and has evolved for millions of years to be perfectly adapted to its environment. Their story continued to generate interest from outdoor recreation websites and wilderness safety organizations that used their experience as a case study in risk assessment and emergency preparedness. While they preferred privacy, both Eric and Dana recognized that sharing their experience might help other people make better decisions about wilderness recreation. If our story helps even one family make different choices about hiking in bear country, then something positive will come from this trauma, Dana reflected during an interview with Outside Magazine. We were incredibly fortunate that our lack of wilderness experience didn't result in serious injuries or death. Bear 394 was located and killed by wildlife management personnel on April 2nd, ending his reign as one of the most problematic bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. GPS tracking data showed that he had continued his systematic investigation of human activity sites right up until his death, confirming that his food conditioning was irreversible and that lethal management was the only viable option for protecting public safety. Dr. Chen's necropsy report revealed that Goliath was in excellent physical condition at the time of his death, weighing 647 pounds and showing no signs of disease or injury that might have explained his unusual behavior. His stomach contents included the remains of food items taken from the Thompson's vehicle, along with natural foods typical of his species. The necropsy confirmed that his problematic behavior was learned rather than caused by physical problems. Bear 394 represented a perfect example of how food conditioning can transform a magnificent wild animal into a public safety threat, Dr. Chen wrote in her final report. His intelligence and adaptability, which should have ensured his survival in wild ecosystems, instead made him increasingly dangerous as he learned to exploit human resources more effectively. The bear's death marked the end of a 3-year period during which he had been involved in over 20 documented incidents of property damage and aggressive behavior toward humans. Wildlife managers estimated that his removal prevented numerous future encounters that could have resulted in human injuries or deaths, though his loss also removed valuable genetic material from the bear population. Eric and Dana's emotional response to news of the bear's death was complex, involving relief at the elimination of a threat combined with sadness at the death of a magnificent animal. Their role in the chain of events that led to his killing added another dimension to their trauma that required continued counseling support to process effectively. I understand that his death was necessary for public safety, but I can't help feeling that we're somehow responsible, Eric admitted during a counseling session in late April. If we had listened to the warnings and chosen a different trail, he might still be alive. Dr. Williams helped them understand that Bear 394's fate had been determined by his cumulative behavioral history rather than their specific encounter. Your experience was simply the final incident that demonstrated his danger to public safety. Other encounters would have occurred regardless of your choices, and the outcome for the bear would likely have been the same. The Hidden Falls Trail remained closed through the remainder of the 2025 hiking season, while wildlife managers implemented enhanced protocols for preventing similar situations from developing with other bears. The closure represented lost recreational opportunities for thousands of visitors, but was necessary to ensure that the area didn't become a continued attractant for problematic wildlife behavior. By summer 2025, Eric and Dana had largely recovered from the acute psychological effects of their bear encounter, though both remained more cautious about outdoor recreation than they had been before their Wyoming experience. Their relationship had been strengthened by surviving shared trauma, but their approach to wilderness adventures had been permanently changed. We still love experiencing wild places, but we have much more respect for the expertise required to do so safely, Dana explained during a follow-up interview 6 months after their encounter. We'll never again dismiss warnings from people who understand wilderness environments better than we do. Their experience became part of wilderness safety training programs used by outdoor recreation organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest. The dramatic nature of their vehicle's destruction provided compelling evidence of the power and intelligence of large predators that helped other people take safety protocols more seriously. Eric resumed hiking in late summer 2025, starting with well-traveled trails in areas with minimal predator activity before gradually building back his confidence in more remote locations. His approach to trip planning now included extensive consultation with local experts and careful attention to wildlife activity reports that he had previously considered routine disclaimers. The experience taught me that there's a difference between being prepared and being truly ready for wilderness emergencies, Eric reflected during a presentation to his investment firm's outdoor recreation club. All the expensive gear in the world can't substitute for understanding the environment you're entering and respecting the creatures that call it home. Dana's return to wilderness recreation was more gradual, as her medical training made her acutely aware of the potential consequences of traumatic injuries in remote locations. However, by autumn 2025, she was again joining Eric on day hikes in familiar areas where they felt confident about the risks and their ability to manage them safely. Their marriage had emerged stronger from the shared trauma of their bear encounter, with both partners having demonstrated care and support for each other under life-threatening stress. The experience had reinforced their commitment to each other while also teaching them to value experiences over material possessions in ways they hadn't understood before. Surviving something like that changes your perspective on what's really important. Dana observed during their first anniversary of the incident. We spent $85,000 on a vehicle that was destroyed in 6 minutes, but we've spent the past year growing closer together and developing a deeper appreciation for life itself. The site where their Land Cruiser was destroyed became part of Dr. Chen's ongoing research into human-wildlife conflict, with trail cameras monitoring the area for signs of continued bear activity. The location showed no evidence of persistent attractants following Goliath's removal, suggesting that his behavioral patterns had been specific to his individual conditioning rather than inherent characteristics of the site. 1 year after their encounter, Eric and Dana returned to Jackson Hole for the first time since their traumatic experience. Their visit was part of their psychological recovery process, allowing them to revisit the location under controlled circumstances and replace traumatic memories with more positive associations. Being back here brings up all the emotions from that day, but also reminds us how beautiful this place is, Eric said, as they looked across Jackson Lake toward the Teton Range. We experienced genuine terror here, but we also survived something that most people never face. There's strength in that survival. Their return visit included meetings with Dr. Chen and other wildlife management personnel who had participated in their rescue and the subsequent management of Bear 394. These conversations provided closure while also contributing to ongoing research into preventing similar human-wildlife conflicts in the future. Your experience has been invaluable for understanding how food-conditioned bears develop systematic approaches to exploiting human resources, Dr. Chen explained during their visit. The data we gathered from your encounter has influenced management protocols throughout the Greater Yellowstone region. The Hidden Falls Trail had reopened by the time of their return visit, with enhanced warning systems and modified camping regulations designed to prevent attractants that might condition future bears to associate human activity with food sources. Their traumatic experience had contributed to improved safety measures that would protect future visitors. Eric and Dana chose not to hike the Hidden Falls Trail during their return visit, instead selecting shorter, more populated routes that allowed them to experience the area's beauty without triggering traumatic memories. Their recovery process involved gradually rebuilding confidence rather than forcing confrontation with their fears. We'll probably never hike that specific trail again, and that's okay, Dana acknowledged as they prepared to leave Jackson Hole. There are thousands of other beautiful places to explore, and we've learned to appreciate them in ways we never did before our encounter with genuine wilderness danger. Their story continued to serve educational purposes for wilderness safety organizations and bear management agencies throughout North America. The systematic destruction of their vehicle provided dramatic evidence of grizzly bear capabilities that helped other people take safety protocols seriously, potentially preventing future human-wildlife conflicts. If sharing our experience helps prevent even one family from making the same mistakes we made, then our trauma serves a valuable purpose, Eric reflected during a final interview for this account. We survived something that many people don't, and we have a responsibility to help others learn from our experience. The total cost of their Wyoming adventure exceeded $150,000 when accounting for vehicle replacement, medical expenses, travel costs, counseling fees, and lost work time. However, both Eric and Dana acknowledged that the experience had provided insights into risk assessment, relationship strength, and personal resilience that couldn't be measured in financial terms. You can't put a price on learning who you really are when everything familiar is stripped away, Dana concluded. We discovered strengths we didn't know we possessed and vulnerabilities we had never acknowledged. In some ways, surviving that encounter was the most important thing that's ever happened to us. Indeed, their marriage remained strong 5 years after their bear encounter, with both partners crediting their shared survival experience as a source of confidence in their ability to support each other through any future challenges. The trauma that had initially threatened their sense of security ultimately strengthened their relationship and their appreciation for life itself. Bear 394's legacy continued through Dr. Chen's research into preventing similar situations from developing with other bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Management protocols developed in response to his case helped wildlife officials identify and address problematic behavior patterns before they reached the level that required lethal management. The parking area where their Land Cruiser was destroyed became a routine stop on educational tours that Dr. Chen conducted for wildlife management professionals from around the world. The site served as a powerful reminder of what could happen when magnificent wild animals lost their natural wariness of humans and learned to exploit human resources systematically. This location represents both a failure and a learning opportunity, Dr. Chen would explain to visiting wildlife managers. We failed to prevent Bear 394's food conditioning from reaching dangerous levels, but his case provided invaluable data for protecting both bears and humans in similar situations throughout North America. Eric and Dana's story became part of wilderness safety curricula at outdoor recreation programs in universities across the United States. Their experience demonstrated the importance of listening to local expertise and understanding that proper equipment couldn't substitute for wilderness knowledge and experience. 10 years after their encounter, Eric and Dana had resumed regular hiking and camping throughout the Pacific Northwest, though their approach to wilderness recreation remained more cautious and informed than it had been before their Wyoming experience. They regularly consulted with local experts before venturing into unfamiliar territory and maintained enhanced safety protocols that reflected their hard-won understanding of wilderness risks. "We're still the same people who love experiencing wild places," Eric reflected during a 10th anniversary interview. "The difference is that we now understand our place in ecosystems that operate according to rules we'll never fully comprehend. That humility has made us safer and more respectful visitors to places that belong to the creatures that evolved there." Their relationship with Jackson Hole and the Greater Yellowstone region evolved from trauma to appreciation over the decade following their encounter. They returned annually to volunteer with wildlife research projects and educational programs, contributing their experience to efforts aimed at preventing similar human-wildlife conflicts. Wyoming will always be the place where we learned how quickly beautiful experiences can become life-threatening situations, Dana acknowledged during their 10th anniversary visit. But it's also where we discovered strengths we didn't know we possessed and deepened our appreciation for the wild places that make life worth living. The memory of Bear 394's systematic destruction of their vehicle remained vivid even 10 years later, serving as a permanent reminder of the power and intelligence of apex predators. However, their traumatic encounter had evolved into a source of wisdom rather than simply fear, providing context for understanding their place in the natural world. Goliath was a magnificent animal that became dangerous because he learned to see humans as resources rather than threats, Eric concluded in his final reflection on their experience. "Our survival was a matter of fortune rather than skill, but the lessons we learned from that encounter have influenced every wilderness adventure we've had since. In that sense, the bear gave us a gift even as he traumatized us, the gift of genuine understanding about our relationship with wild nature." Their story stood as testament to both the dangers and the transformative power of authentic wilderness experience, demonstrating that some of life's most important lessons could only be learned through direct confrontation with forces beyond human control. The 6 minutes during which Bear 394 destroyed their vehicle had taught them more about risk, resilience, and respect for nature than decades of conventional outdoor recreation. We went to Wyoming looking for adventure and found something much more profound, an understanding of our own mortality and our place in systems much larger and more powerful than ourselves. Dana concluded. That knowledge has made us better people, better partners, and more thoughtful visitors to the wild places we love. The next stories. Bear destroys patrol boat, kills fisherman. August 10th, 2024. Bear destroys patrol boat, kills fisherman. August 10th, 2024. The morning mist hung thick over the Kenai River like a shroud, its tendrils clinging to the dark water as if reluctant to let the day begin. Alaska wildlife trooper Jonas Nathaniel Burke pushed his 18-foot aluminum patrol skiff through the gentle current, the 40-horsepower Mercury outboard purring softly behind him. At 42 years old, Jonas had spent the better part of 2 decades patrolling these waters, first as a commercial fisherman like his father before him, then as a fish and game enforcement officer, and finally as a state trooper specializing in wilderness law enforcement. The Kenai Peninsula was in his blood, as much a part of him as the weathered hands that gripped the boat's steering wheel, or the steel-gray eyes that constantly scanned the riverbanks for signs of illegal activity. The date was August 10th, 2024, and the salmon run was at its peak. Thousands of silver-bright coho and massive king salmon were surging upriver to spawn, creating a feeding frenzy that drew not only legitimate anglers, but also poachers willing to violate fishing regulations for a quick profit. Jonas had already written 3 citations this morning for over-limit violations, and it wasn't even 9 o'clock yet. The radio crackled occasionally with routine traffic from other officers scattered across the peninsula, but for now, Jonas was alone on this particular stretch of river, approximately 12 miles upstream from Kenai Town, in an area locals called the Deadwood Bend. The name wasn't chosen lightly. This section of the river curved in a lazy S-shape around a massive fallen Sitka spruce that had toppled during a windstorm 3 years earlier. The dead fall created a natural log jam that forced the current into deeper channels, making it prime fishing territory, but also dangerous for inexperienced boaters. More importantly for Jonas's current concerns, the area was a known congregation point for brown bears and grizzlies drawn by the salmon run. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had recorded 47 different individual bears using this stretch of river during the peak of salmon season, including several massive boars weighing over 800 pounds. Jonas throttled back the engine as he approached the bend, his trained eye automatically cataloguing the scene before him. The morning was unusually quiet. Typically, by this time, he would have encountered at least a dozen fishing boats, both guided sports fishing charters and local anglers. Today, however, the river seemed almost deserted. A persistent drizzle had begun during the night, and the overcast sky promised more rain to come. The weather had likely discouraged many of the fair-weather fishermen, leaving only the most dedicated anglers on the water. As he rounded the first curve of the bend, Jonas spotted what he was looking for: a small aluminum boat anchored near the opposite bank, where an angler in rain gear was casting into a likely-looking pool. At this distance, perhaps 200 yards away, Jonas couldn't make out specific details, but something about the setup immediately raised his suspicions. The boat appeared to be positioned directly over a known spawning bed, an area that had been closed to fishing for the past 2 weeks to protect spawning salmon. Jonas reached for his binoculars, a high-quality pair of Leica Ultravid that had been a retirement gift from his former partner, Detective Maria Santos Rodriguez. Through the magnified lenses, Jonas could see that his suspicions were correct. The angler was using what appeared to be a large treble hook rig, almost certainly snagging salmon rather than fishing legally with hook and line. Worse, Jonas could see at least 6 large fish already in the boat, far exceeding the daily limit of 2 salmon per angler. This was exactly the kind of violation that Jonas had dedicated his career to preventing, the kind that threatened the delicate balance of Alaska's fisheries resources. Jonas keyed his radio microphone. "Dispatch, this is Trooper Burke, badge number 1247. I'm at mile marker 12 on the Kenai River, Deadwood Bend area. I have a potential fishing violation in progress. I'm going to make contact with the suspect vessel." The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the radio speaker. "Copy, Trooper Burke. Be advised, we've had multiple bear sightings reported in that area this morning. Exercise appropriate caution." 10-4, dispatch. I'm aware of the bear activity in this area. Jonas throttled up and began approaching the suspect boat, following standard protocol for water-based enforcement contacts. He would approach from an angle that gave him the best view of the angler's activities, while positioning his boat to prevent the suspect from fleeing upstream. As he drew closer, Jonas could see that the angler was a middle-aged man with graying hair beneath a faded baseball cap. The man's rain jacket bore the logo of Alaskan Guide Services, one of the larger charter operations in the area, though Jonas didn't recognize this particular individual. What concerned Jonas more than the fishing violations, however, was what he observed through his peripheral vision. On the far bank, perhaps 50 yards upstream from the suspect angler, a large, dark shape was moving through the thick brush of willow and alder. Jonas had spent enough time in bear country to recognize the distinctive rolling gait of a large brown bear making its way toward the river. The bear appeared to be following a well-worn game trail that led directly to the water's edge, likely one of many paths used by bears to access prime fishing spots during salmon season. Jonas estimated the bear's size at somewhere between 6 and 7 feet at the shoulder, which would put its weight at approximately 400 to 500 pounds if it was a sow, or potentially much larger if it was a mature boar. At this distance and through the thick vegetation, it was impossible to determine the animal's sex or exact size, but Jonas's experience told him this was likely a significant bear, one that would not be easily deterred from its intended path to the salmon-rich waters. The angler in the suspect boat seemed completely oblivious to the approaching bear, focused entirely on his illegal fishing activities. Jonas faced a tactical dilemma: approach the boat to conduct the enforcement action and potentially place both himself and the angler in danger from the approaching bear, or withdraw to a safe distance and risk losing the suspect, who might flee once he spotted the patrol boat. Jonas made his decision quickly. Public safety trumped wildlife violations, no matter how flagrant. He throttled up and changed course, heading directly toward the suspect boat while simultaneously reaching for his air horn, a standard piece of equipment designed to deter bears in emergency situations. As his patrol skiff closed the distance, Jonas began shouting warnings to the angler. "Sir, you need to be aware there's a large bear approaching your location. I'm Alaska State Trooper Burke, and I need you to start your engine and prepare to move to safer water." The angler looked up from his illegal activities, initially appearing annoyed at the interruption. Jonas could now see that the man was approximately 55 years old, with a weathered face that spoke of many years spent outdoors. A name tag on his rain jacket identified him as Chuck Morrison Guide, confirming Jonas's suspicions about his affiliation with Alaskan Guide Services. "What bear?" Morrison called back, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "I don't see any bear." Jonas pointed toward the far bank, where the dark shape was now clearly visible as it emerged from the thick brush. The bear was indeed a large one, Jonas could now see, and it was moving with the purposeful stride of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. More concerning still, Jonas noticed that the bear's ears were laid back against its head, and its head was swinging from side to side in the characteristic motion of an agitated or stressed animal. "Right there, sir. On the far bank. You need to move your boat immediately." Chuck Morrison turned to look in the direction Jonas was pointing, and Jonas saw the man's face change from annoyance to alarm as he spotted the approaching bear. Morrison immediately reached for his boat's starter cord, but in his haste he yanked too hard and flooded the engine. The small outboard sputtered and died, leaving Morrison stranded in increasingly dangerous water. Jonas gunned his own engine, racing to reach Morrison's boat before the bear entered the water. Brown bears were excellent swimmers, capable of covering significant distances in water, and Jonas knew that a bear motivated by hunger and territorial instincts could easily swim the 100 yards or so that separated it from the two boats. As his patrol skiff closed the final 50 yards to Morrison's position, Jonas could see the bear had now reached the water's edge and was standing upright on its hind legs, testing the air with its sensitive nose. The bear was even larger than Jonas had initially estimated. Standing fully upright, the animal towered at least 8 feet above the riverbank, its massive shoulders and thick neck indicating this was likely a mature boar in prime condition. The salmon run had been excellent this year, providing ample feeding opportunities for the peninsula's bear population, and this particular animal showed every sign of being well-fed and powerful. Its coat was a rich chocolate brown with silver-tipped guard hairs, typical of the interior brown bears that populated this region of Alaska. Jonas pulled alongside Morrison's boat and immediately began assessing the situation. Morrison had managed to restart his engine, but the small 15-horsepower outboard was clearly struggling against the current. The bear, meanwhile, had dropped back to all fours and was now pacing back and forth along the riverbank, its attention clearly focused on the salmon-rich waters where the two boats were positioned. "Sir, I'm Trooper Burke with Alaska State Troopers," Jonas called out, trying to keep his voice calm and authoritative despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I need you to follow me downstream to safer water, and then we're going to need to discuss your fishing activities here today." Morrison nodded vigorously, his earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of the massive predator watching them from the bank. "Yes, sir. Whatever you say. I just want to get out of here." Jonas took the lead, guiding Morrison's boat downstream and away from the bear's position. As they moved through the water, Jonas kept one eye on their back trail, watching for any sign that the bear might enter the water in pursuit. Brown bears were generally not aggressive toward humans unless they felt threatened or were protecting cubs or a food source. But during salmon season, territorial disputes were common, and human presence near prime fishing spots could trigger defensive behavior. As they rounded the first bend, putting solid ground between themselves and the bear, Jonas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. The immediate danger had passed, and now he could focus on the law enforcement aspect of the encounter. He guided Morrison toward a small gravel bar that extended into the river, providing a safe place to beach both boats and conduct the necessary paperwork. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your fishing license and any tags or stamps you might have," Jonas called out as they approached the gravel bar. "I also need to inspect your catch and your fishing equipment." Morrison's boat crunched against the gravel, and he immediately shut off his engine. Jonas could see that the man was shaking, whether from the adrenaline of the bear encounter or the realization that he was about to face serious fishing violations. Jonas couldn't tell. As Morrison stepped out of his boat, Jonas got his first clear look at the illegal catch that had prompted the enforcement action. 6 large salmon lay in the bottom of Morrison's boat, all of them clearly over the size limit, and several showing the telltale signs of having been snagged rather than caught legally. The treble hook rig Jonas had observed through his binoculars was still attached to Morrison's fishing rod, a clear violation of Alaska's fishing regulations that required the use of single barbless hooks in this particular section of river. "Mr. Morrison," Jonas began, pulling out his citation book, "I observed you fishing in a closed spawning area using illegal gear, and you appear to have exceeded your daily bag limit. I'm going to have to cite you for multiple violations of Alaska's fishing regulations." Morrison hung his head, seemingly resigned to his fate. "Look, Trooper, I know I screwed up. I've been guiding for 20 years and I should know better. I've just been having a tough season and I thought maybe I could make up for some lost time. Those fish are worth good money if you know where to sell them." Jonas shook his head. This was exactly the kind of thinking that threatened Alaska's fisheries. Short-term profit at the expense of long-term conservation was a mindset that Jonas had encountered countless times during his career, and it never failed to frustrate him. The salmon runs that brought tourists and revenue to Alaska depended on careful management and strict enforcement of fishing regulations. Guides like Morrison, who should be setting an example for visiting anglers, instead chose to exploit the resource for immediate gain. As Jonas began writing the citations, his radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "All units in the Kenai River area, be advised we have reports of an aggressive bear incident at mile marker 11, approximately 1 mile downstream from the Deadwood Bend. Responding units use extreme caution." Jonas looked up from his citation book, a chill running down his spine. Mile marker 11 was exactly where he and Morrison had retreated to escape the bear. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Jonas keyed his radio microphone. "Dispatch, this is Trooper Burke. I may have information relevant to that bear incident. I had a close encounter with a large brown bear at the Deadwood Bend approximately 15 minutes ago. The animal appeared agitated and was showing territorial behavior." "Copy, Trooper Burke. Can you respond to mile marker 11 to assist with the incident?" Jonas looked at Morrison, who was standing beside his boat full of illegal salmon, awaiting the completion of his citation. The law enforcement action would have to be completed, but the bear incident took priority. Jonas made a quick decision. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to have to ask you to secure your boat and come with me. There's been another bear incident downstream, and I may need your assistance as a witness to the bear's behavior and location." Morrison nodded, clearly relieved to have a reprieve from the citation process, even if it meant potentially encountering the bear again. They quickly secured Morrison's boat to the gravel bar, and both men climbed into Jonas's patrol skiff. As Jonas fired up the outboard and began heading downstream, he couldn't shake the feeling that the morning's events were connected in some way that he didn't yet understand. The radio continued to crackle with updates from the incident scene. A guided fishing charter had reported that their boat had been approached by a large brown bear that had entered the water and attempted to climb aboard their vessel. The guide had managed to fend off the bear with an oar, but not before the animal had caused significant damage to the boat and injured one of the clients. Emergency medical services were en route, and fish and game officers were being dispatched to locate and assess the bear. As Jonas's boat rounded the next bend in the river, he could see the scene of the incident ahead. A 24-foot drift boat was pulled up on the opposite bank, its fiberglass hull showing deep claw marks along the gunnels. Several people were gathered around the boat, including what appeared to be an injured person lying on the ground. Jonas could see the distinctive uniform of a fish and game officer, indicating that emergency responders had already arrived on scene. Jonas throttled back as he approached the incident scene, following proper protocol for emergency response on the water. As he drew closer, he could see that the injured person was a middle-aged woman, probably in her 50s, who appeared to be conscious but in obvious distress. A paramedic was kneeling beside her, working to stabilize what Jonas could now see were significant lacerations on her left arm and shoulder. Trooper Burke responding to assist, Jonas called out as he beached his boat near the drift boat. The fish and game officer, whom Jonas recognized as Wildlife Trooper Sarah Chen, looked up from her examination of the damaged boat. "Jonas, glad you're here," Chen called back. "We've got a victim with significant bear mauling injuries, and from the damage to this boat, we're dealing with a very large and aggressive animal. The guide says the bear entered the water and actually climbed partially into the boat before he managed to drive it off." Jonas secured his boat and approached the scene, Morrison following close behind. The injured woman, who Jonas could now see was identified by her fishing vest as Helen Rodriguez from Anchorage, was conscious and alert, but clearly in shock. The paramedic, a young man whose name tag identified him as EMT Kevin Walsh, was working to control bleeding from what appeared to be 4 parallel claw marks across the woman's upper arm. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened?" Jonas asked, kneeling beside the injured woman while being careful not to interfere with the paramedic's work. Helen Rodriguez looked up at Jonas with wide, frightened eyes. "It came out of nowhere," she said, her voice shaky but clear. "We were fishing in that deep pool over there, and Tom, that's our guide, he said he saw something moving in the woods. The next thing we knew, this huge bear was swimming straight toward our boat. Tom tried to scare it off with the oar, but it just kept coming. When it reached the boat, it actually climbed up onto the side, and that's when it got me with its claws." Jonas looked around for the guide she had mentioned and spotted a man in his 30s standing near the bow of the damaged drift boat. The guide, who wore a name tag identifying him as Tom Hartwell, Kenai River Guide Service, was examining the extensive damage to his boat with obvious dismay. Deep claw marks scored the fiberglass hull, and one of the gunnels had been partially crushed by the bear's weight. "Tom, I'm Trooper Burke," Jonas called out. "Can you walk me through what happened here?" Tom Hartwell looked up from his damaged boat, his face still showing signs of the adrenaline and fear from the encounter. "I've been guiding on this river for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like it," he began. "We were anchored in the pool over there, maybe 100 yards upstream, when I noticed movement in the brush on the far bank. At first, I thought it might be a moose or maybe a smaller black bear, so I wasn't too concerned. Then this massive brown bear emerged from the trees and just stood there, looking directly at our boat." Jonas nodded, encouraging Tom to continue while mentally noting the timeline and location details. "The bear stood up on its hind legs, like they do when they're trying to get a better view, and I could tell right away that this was a really big animal. I'd guess it was pushing 7 feet at the shoulder, maybe 800 pounds or more. I told my clients to reel in their lines and prepare to move, but before we could start the engine, the bear dropped down and entered the water." "Did the bear show any signs of aggression before it entered the water?" Jonas asked. Tom shook his head. "That's what was so strange about it. The bear didn't seem angry or threatened. It just looked determined, like it had decided it wanted to investigate our boat and nothing was going to stop it. It swam directly toward us, not hesitating or testing the water, just a straight line from the bank to our boat." Sarah Chen looked up from her examination of the boat damage. "Tom, how long did it take the bear to reach your boat once it entered the water?" "Maybe 2 minutes at most," Tom replied. "Brown bears are strong swimmers, but this one seemed especially powerful. When it reached the boat, it put its front paws up on the gunwale and started to pull itself up. That's when I grabbed the oar and tried to push it back into the water." Jonas examined the claw marks on the boat's hull, noting their depth and spacing. The marks were consistent with those of a large brown bear, and their position indicated that the animal had indeed attempted to climb into the boat. What concerned Jonas most was the determination that Tom had described. Bears typically avoided humans unless they were protecting cubs or a food source, or unless they had become habituated to human presence through food conditioning. "Tom, did you or your clients have any food in the boat?" Any fish you had caught or lunch or anything that might have attracted the bear? Tom shook his head. No food at all. We always follow strict protocols about food storage when we're on the water. We hadn't caught any fish yet, and we don't eat lunch until we get back to the lodge. The only thing in the boat was our fishing gear and safety equipment. This information troubled Jonas. A bear that approached and attacked a boat without the motivation of food was exhibiting unusual and potentially dangerous behavior. Such behavior could indicate a stressed or injured animal, or possibly a bear that had become territorial about a particular area during salmon season. EMT Walsh looked up from his work on Helen Rodriguez's injuries. "I need to get her to the hospital as soon as possible," he announced. "The lacerations are deep, and there's a risk of infection from the bear's claws. We also need to start her on prophylactic antibiotics and possibly rabies post-exposure prophylaxis, depending on the bear's health status." Jonas nodded. "How are we evacuating her? By boat or helicopter?" "Life flight is en route," Walsh replied. "ETA about 15 minutes. We'll need to clear a landing zone on that gravel bar over there." As the evacuation preparations began, Jonas found himself thinking about the bear's behavior and the timeline of events. The bear he and Morrison had encountered at Deadwood Bend had been showing signs of agitation, and now, less than 30 minutes later, a bear, possibly the same animal, had attacked a boat approximately 1 mile downstream. The geography of the river and the timing suggested that this could indeed be the same bear, following the river corridor as it searched for food or territory. Sarah Chen approached Jonas as he was studying a map of the local area. "What are you thinking, Jonas? You mentioned on the radio that you had an encounter with a bear upstream." Jonas described his morning encounter with Morrison and the large brown bear at Deadwood Bend, including his observations about the animal's size, behavior, and apparent agitation. As he spoke, Chen nodded grimly. "The timeline and location are consistent," she said. "If this is the same bear, we're dealing with an animal that's showing increasingly aggressive behavior toward humans. That's not a good sign." What's the protocol for a situation like this?" Jonas asked, though he already knew the answer would likely involve tracking and potentially destroying the bear if it continued to pose a threat to public safety. "First, we need to get this area evacuated and posted with warning signs," Chen replied. "Then we need to get a tracking team in here to locate the bear and assess its behavior. If it continues to show aggressive tendencies toward humans, especially unprovoked aggression, we may have to make the decision to destroy it." The sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the canyon walls as Life Flight approached the landing zone. Jonas and the other responders cleared the area as the helicopter settled onto the gravel bar, its rotor wash stirring up clouds of sand and debris. The medical crew quickly transferred Helen Rodriguez from the EMT's care to the helicopter's more advanced medical equipment, and within minutes, the aircraft was airborne again, heading toward the regional medical center in Anchorage. With the immediate medical emergency resolved, Jonas found himself facing the larger question of public safety. The Kenai River was one of Alaska's most popular fishing destinations, with hundreds of boats and thousands of anglers using the waterway during peak salmon season. A bear exhibiting aggressive behavior toward boats posed a significant threat to public safety, and Jonas knew that decisive action would be required. Sarah Chen was already on her radio, coordinating with Fish and Game headquarters to establish an emergency closure of the affected area. "I need all boat traffic stopped between mile markers 10 and 13, she was saying. "We have an aggressive bear situation, and I don't want any more people in the water until we can locate and assess the animal." Jonas looked at Chuck Morrison, who had been standing quietly nearby during the emergency response. The fishing violations that had brought them together seemed trivial now in the face of a potential public safety crisis. But Jonas still had a job to do. "Mr. Morrison, given the circumstances, I'm going to release you on your own recognizance with a court date for the fishing violations," Jonas said. "But I need you to stay available as a witness to the bear's behavior and location. Your observations might be important for the tracking team." Morrison nodded gratefully. "Of course, Trooper. And I want you to know that I'm sorry about the fishing thing. I know better, and there's no excuse for it. If there's anything I can do to help with this bear situation, I'm willing." Jonas handed Morrison a citation with a court date and his business card. "If you think of anything else about the bear's behavior that might be useful, call me immediately. Even small details could be important." As Morrison prepared to leave the scene, Jonas's radio crackled with another transmission from dispatch. "All units in the Kenai River area, we have another reported bear incident at mile marker 9. Multiple boats are requesting assistance. Possible bear in the water, approaching recreational vessels." Jonas felt his stomach drop. Mile marker 9 was another 2 miles downstream from their current location. If this was the same bear, it was continuing to move down the river and encountering more boats along the way. The situation was escalating rapidly, and Jonas realized that they might be dealing with a pattern of aggressive behavior rather than isolated incidents. "Sarah, I need to respond to this new incident," Jonas called out. "Can you coordinate the area closure from here?" Chen nodded. "Go ahead. I'll establish a command post here and coordinate with headquarters. Keep me updated on what you find downstream." Jonas jumped back into his patrol skiff and fired up the outboard. As he headed downstream toward mile marker 9, his mind raced through the possibilities. A bear that was systematically approaching and attacking boats was exhibiting behavior that was virtually unprecedented in his 2 decades of wildlife law enforcement. Such behavior could indicate rabies, though rabies was extremely rare in Alaska's bear population. More likely, the bear was either injured and acting defensively, or it had become habituated to humans through improper food storage or feeding. As Jonas's boat rounded the next bend in the river, he could see the scene at mile marker 9 ahead of him. 3 recreational fishing boats were clustered together in the middle of the river, their occupants obviously agitated and pointing toward the eastern bank. As Jonas drew closer, he could see what had captured their attention. A large brown bear was standing in shallow water near the riverbank, apparently focused on the boats in the river. Jonas approached the cluster of boats cautiously, not wanting to provoke the bear into more aggressive action. As he drew alongside the nearest boat, a blue and white aluminum fishing skiff occupied by an elderly couple, the man immediately began talking rapidly. "Officer, thank God you're here. That bear has been stalking us for the past 10 minutes. We were fishing over by those downed trees when it came out of the woods and just stood there watching us. When we tried to move away, it followed us along the bank. Then it actually started wading into the water toward us." Jonas looked toward the bear, which was indeed standing in water up to its chest, approximately 75 yards from the boats. Even at this distance, Jonas could see that this was a large animal, consistent in size with the bear he had encountered earlier that morning. The bear's head was held high, its ears were forward, and it was clearly focused on the boats and their occupants. "Sir, I'm Trooper Burke with Alaska State Troopers," Jonas called out to the elderly angler. "I need you and the other boats to slowly move downstream while I deal with this situation. Do not make any sudden movements or loud noises." The elderly man nodded vigorously. "Whatever you say, officer. We just want to get out of here safely." Jonas watched as the 3 recreational boats began moving slowly downstream, following his instructions to avoid provoking the bear. As the boats moved away, Jonas noticed that the bear's attention remained fixed on them, and the animal actually began moving deeper into the water, as if preparing to swim after them. This behavior confirmed Jonas's worst fears. The bear was actively pursuing boats and their occupants, showing a level of aggressive behavior that posed an immediate threat to public safety. Jonas reached for his rifle, a .306 Springfield that was standard equipment for Alaska state troopers working in wilderness areas. He had hoped never to use the weapon on wildlife, but the safety of the public had to take priority. Jonas also reached for his air horn, hoping that the loud noise might deter the bear without requiring lethal action. He sounded 3 long blasts on the horn, the sharp sound echoing off the canyon walls. The bear's reaction was immediate and alarming. Instead of retreating, the animal turned its attention to Jonas's boat and began swimming directly toward him. Jonas found himself in exactly the situation he had been trained for, but had hoped never to face. A large, aggressive brown bear was swimming directly toward his boat, showing no fear of humans or loud noises. The bear was approximately 50 yards away and closing fast, its powerful swimming stroke propelling it through the water with surprising speed. Jonas raised his rifle and chambered a round, following the protocol he had practiced countless times during training but had never used in the field. Alaska state troopers were authorized to use lethal force against wildlife when human life was in immediate danger, but the decision was never taken lightly. Jonas knew that killing this bear would require extensive documentation and investigation, but the alternative, allowing a dangerous animal to continue threatening public safety, was unacceptable. "This is Trooper Burke on the Kenai River," Jonas called into his radio microphone while keeping his rifle trained on the approaching bear. "I have an aggressive brown bear swimming toward my position. I may need to use lethal force. All units be advised." The bear was now 30 yards away and showed no signs of slowing down. Jonas could see the animal's eyes, small and dark, fixed directly on him. The bear's ears were laid back against its head, a sign of aggressive intent. Jonas estimated the animal's weight at close to 800 pounds, making it one of the largest bears he had ever encountered. 20 yards. The bear's powerful front paws were cutting through the water with methodical precision. Jonas had a clear shot, but he hesitated, hoping the animal would change course or show some sign of retreat. Killing a healthy brown bear was a last resort, and Jonas wanted to be absolutely certain that lethal force was necessary. 10 yards. The bear was close enough now that Jonas could see the water streaming from its thick fur, could hear the rhythmic splash of its swimming stroke. There was no longer any doubt about the animal's intentions. Jonas centered the rifle's crosshairs on the bear's head and began to squeeze the trigger. At 5 yards from Jonas's boat, the bear suddenly stopped swimming and raised its head above water, as if reassessing the situation. For a moment, bear and human stared at each other across the narrow gap of dark water. Jonas held his fire, hoping that the bear might finally show some sign of retreat. Then, with a speed that caught Jonas completely off guard, the bear lunged forward and grabbed the side of the patrol skiff with its massive front paws. The aluminum boat tilted sharply to starboard under the animal's weight, and Jonas found himself staring directly into the bear's face from a distance of less than 3 feet. The bear's eyes were intelligent and focused, showing none of the confusion or distress that might indicate rabies or injury. This was a healthy, powerful animal that had made a deliberate decision to approach and attack human beings. The bear's mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were yellowed but intact, and Jonas could smell the animal's breath, rank with the scent of salmon and wilderness. For a split second, time seemed suspended. Jonas was acutely aware of every detail: the texture of the bear's wet fur, the clicking sound of its claws against the aluminum boat hull, the weight of the rifle in his hands. Then the bear began to pull itself up onto the boat, and Jonas knew that he was out of time. The rifle shot was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the river canyon. Jonas had aimed for the center of the bear's head from point-blank range, and the heavy .30-06 bullet struck exactly where intended. The massive animal's head snapped back from the impact, and it immediately released its grip on the boat and slipped back into the water. Jonas watched as the bear's body floated motionless in the current, a spreading stain of blood marking the water around it. The animal had died instantly, killed by a single, well-placed shot that had been necessary to prevent a potentially fatal mauling. Jonas felt no satisfaction in the kill, only relief that the immediate threat had been neutralized and sadness that such action had been necessary. Jonas immediately called for backup and began the process of documenting the shooting. Alaska law required extensive documentation whenever a law enforcement officer used lethal force against wildlife, and Jonas knew that his actions would be thoroughly investigated by both his own department and fish and game officials. The bear's body would need to be recovered and examined by wildlife biologists to determine if there were any underlying health issues that might have explained its aggressive behavior. As Jonas waited for backup to arrive, he reflected on the morning's events. In the space of less than 2 hours, he had encountered multiple bear incidents involving the same animal, culminating in a life-or-death confrontation that had required lethal force. Such a sequence of events was virtually unprecedented in Alaska's wildlife management history, and Jonas knew that the incident would likely result in changes to safety protocols for both law enforcement officers and recreational users of Alaska's waterways. The radio crackled with updates as multiple agencies responded to the scene. Fish and game officers, additional state troopers, and emergency medical personnel were all en route to mile marker 9. The incident had escalated from a routine fishing violation into a major wildlife emergency that would require coordinated response from multiple agencies. As the first backup units arrived on scene, Jonas began the lengthy process of documenting every detail of the morning's events. The investigation would examine not only the final shooting, but also the bear's behavior throughout the morning, looking for clues about what might have motivated such unusual and aggressive conduct. Wildlife biologists would perform a necropsy on the bear's body, examining it for signs of disease, injury, or other factors that might explain its behavior. Sarah Chen arrived on scene within 30 minutes of the shooting, accompanied by a team of fish and game investigators. As the senior wildlife officer on scene, Chen would coordinate the investigation and ensure that all proper protocols were followed. Jonas appreciated her presence, knowing that her expertise and professionalism would help ensure that the incident was handled correctly. "Jonas, I need you to walk me through everything that happened here," Chen said as she approached his boat. "Start from when you arrived on scene and take me through every detail, no matter how small." Jonas spent the next hour providing a detailed account of the bear's behavior and his decision to use lethal force. Chen took careful notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions to clarify specific details. The investigation would ultimately determine whether Jonas's actions were justified, but Chen's initial assessment was that he had followed proper protocols and had acted to protect both his own life and the safety of other river users. The bear's body was recovered by a fish and game crew using a specialized boat equipped with a winch and lifting equipment. Even in death, the animal was impressive, measuring over 7 feet from nose to tail and weighing an estimated 850 pounds. Wildlife biologists began their preliminary examination immediately, looking for obvious signs of injury or disease that might explain the bear's aggressive behavior. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the senior wildlife biologist overseeing the examination, made her initial findings available to the investigating team. This appears to be a healthy adult male brown bear, approximately 12 to 15 years old, based on tooth wear and body condition, she reported. There are no obvious signs of injury, disease, or malnutrition. The animal appears to have been in excellent physical condition at the time of death. These findings only deepened the mystery of the bear's behavior. A healthy, well-fed brown bear had no obvious motivation for the aggressive behavior it had displayed throughout the morning. Dr. Reeves indicated that a complete necropsy would be performed at the Fish and Game Laboratory in Anchorage, including tests for rabies, toxins, and other potential factors that might explain the animal's conduct. As the investigation continued, word of the incident began to spread throughout the local community and beyond. The Kenai River was a major tourist destination, and news of an aggressive bear attack quickly attracted media attention. Local television stations and newspapers began reporting on the incident, and Jonas found himself fielding calls from reporters seeking details about the morning's events. The immediate aftermath of the shooting also required coordination with local guide services and outfitters to ensure that their clients were aware of the potential danger and that appropriate safety measures were in place. The Fish and Game Service issued an emergency closure of the affected section of river, and warning signs were posted at boat launches and access points throughout the area. Jonas's shift finally ended late that evening, more than 12 hours after it had begun with what he had expected to be a routine patrol of the Kenai River. As he drove home to his small cabin outside Soldotna, Jonas reflected on the day's events and their implications for wildlife management in Alaska. The shooting of the brown bear had been necessary to protect human life, but it also represented a failure of the coexistence between humans and wildlife that Alaska strived to maintain. In the days that followed, the investigation into the bear incident would expand to include an examination of human activities in the area that might have contributed to the animal's aggressive behavior. Investigators would look at camping practices, food storage protocols, and any instances of illegal feeding or baiting that might have habituated the bear to human presence. They would also examine the possibility that the bear's territory had been disrupted by development or other human activities, forcing it into conflict with people using the river. The necropsy results, when they became available 2 weeks later, would provide few answers to the questions raised by the bear's behavior. Dr. Reeves's team found no evidence of rabies, toxins, or other medical conditions that might explain the animal's aggression. The bear appeared to have been a healthy, mature male in prime condition, with no obvious motivation for the behavior it had displayed. The mystery of the bear's aggressive behavior would ultimately remain unsolved, adding to the growing body of evidence that climate change and human encroachment were altering wildlife behavior patterns throughout Alaska. The incident would lead to enhanced safety protocols for law enforcement officers working in bear country and to increased public education about bear safety for recreational users of Alaska's wilderness areas. For Jonas, the incident would mark a turning point in his career. The shooting had been justified and necessary, but it had also highlighted the increasing conflicts between humans and wildlife in Alaska's rapidly changing landscape. Jonas would continue his work as a wilderness law enforcement officer, but with a deeper appreciation for the complex challenges facing Alaska's wildlife managers and the delicate balance required to maintain both public safety and wildlife conservation. The bear's death would also serve as a reminder of the power and unpredictability of Alaska's wilderness. The Kenai River, like much of Alaska, remained a place where humans were visitors in a landscape dominated by forces beyond their control. The morning of August 10th, 2024, had demonstrated that even experienced outdoorsmen like Jonas Burke could find themselves in life-threatening situations with little warning, requiring split-second decisions that would have lasting consequences for both human and wildlife communities. As the investigation concluded and the media attention faded, the Kenai River would return to its normal rhythms of salmon runs and recreational fishing. But for those who had been present on August 10th, the memory of the aggressive brown bear and the circumstances that led to its death would serve as a lasting reminder of the wild and unpredictable nature of Alaska's wilderness, and the constant vigilance required of those who chose to work and play in bear country. The incident would ultimately be documented in a detailed report by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, becoming part of the official record of human-wildlife conflicts in Alaska. The report would be used to develop improved safety protocols and training programs for law enforcement officers, guide services, and recreational users of Alaska's waterways. Jonas's actions on August 10th, while tragic in their necessity, would ultimately contribute to enhanced safety measures that would help prevent similar incidents in the future. The brown bear that died in the Kenai River that morning had lived its entire life in the wilderness of Alaska, following ancient patterns of behavior that had served its species well for thousands of years. Its death marked not just the end of an individual animal's life, but also a symbol of the ongoing challenges facing Alaska's wildlife as human presence in the wilderness continued to expand. The bear's story would become part of the larger narrative of Alaska's struggle to balance conservation, public safety, and economic development in one of the world's last great wilderness areas. For the recreational anglers who had been present during the morning's events, the incident would serve as a sobering reminder of the risks inherent in Alaska's wilderness recreation. Helen Rodriguez, who had been injured in the bear's attack on the drift boat, would recover fully from her physical injuries, but would never again feel completely comfortable fishing in Alaska's remote waters. The psychological impact of the attack would affect not only the direct victims, but also the broader community of Alaska's outdoor enthusiasts, many of whom would reassess their own safety practices and preparedness for wildlife encounters. The investigation into the bear incident would also examine the role of guide services and outfitters in ensuring client safety in bear country. Tom Hartwell's quick thinking and decisive action had likely prevented more serious injuries during the attack on his drift boat. But the incident would lead to enhanced training requirements for Alaska's guides and stricter protocols for operating in areas with high bear activity. The guide service industry, which depended on Alaska's reputation as a safe destination for wilderness recreation, would invest heavily in improved safety equipment and training programs in the aftermath of the August 10th incident. Chuck Morrison's fishing violations, which had initially brought Jonas to the Deadwood Bend area, would ultimately be adjudicated through Alaska's court system. Morrison would plead guilty to the charges and pay substantial fines, but his cooperation with the bear investigation and his genuine remorse for his actions would be taken into consideration during sentencing. The incident would serve as a wake-up call for Morrison, who would subsequently become an advocate for conservation and legal fishing practices, often speaking to other guides and anglers about the importance of following regulations designed to protect Alaska's fisheries resources. The media coverage of the bear incident would bring national attention to the challenges of wildlife management in Alaska, highlighting both the successes and failures of current conservation policies. Environmental groups would use the incident to advocate for stricter regulations on human activities in critical wildlife habitat, while hunting and fishing organizations would emphasize the importance of maintaining access to Alaska's public lands and waters. The debate would continue long after the immediate crisis had passed, reflecting the ongoing tension between conservation and recreation in Alaska's wilderness areas. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves and her team at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game would continue to study the bear incident as part of their broader research into changing wildlife behavior patterns in Alaska. The aggressive behavior displayed by the brown bear on August 10th would be compared to similar incidents throughout Alaska and other regions, with large bear populations, looking for patterns that might help predict and prevent future conflicts. The research would contribute to a growing body of scientific literature on human-wildlife conflicts in an era of climate change and expanding human development. The necropsy findings that showed no obvious cause for the bear's aggressive behavior would puzzle wildlife biologists for years to come. Various theories would be proposed, ranging from territorial disputes with other bears to stress caused by unusual salmon run patterns, but none would be definitively proven. The incident would serve as a reminder of how much remained unknown about the complex factors that influence wildlife behavior and of the need for continued research and monitoring of Alaska's bear populations. Jonas Burke would continue his career with Alaska State Troopers, but the events of August 10th would influence his approach to wilderness law enforcement for the remainder of his career. He would become an advocate for enhanced training in wildlife encounters for law enforcement officers and would frequently speak at training academies and professional conferences about the lessons learned from the bear incident. His experience would help develop improved protocols for officer safety in bear country and would contribute to the training of a new generation of wilderness law enforcement professionals. The patrol skiff that Jonas had been using on August 10th would be retired from active service and donated to a local museum, where it would serve as a reminder of the challenges faced by Alaska's law enforcement officers. The boat's aluminum hull, which had been scratched and dented by the bear's claws, would be preserved as evidence of the encounter, providing visitors with a tangible connection to the events of that morning on the Kenai River. Years later, the incident would be studied by researchers examining the psychological impact of wildlife encounters on both professionals and recreational users of Alaska's wilderness areas. The trauma experienced by Helen Rodriguez and other witnesses would be documented as part of a broader understanding of how such incidents affect individual and community perceptions of wildlife and wilderness safety. The research would contribute to improved support services for victims of wildlife attacks and would help develop better protocols for managing the psychological aftermath of such encounters. The brown bear that died on August 10th, 2024, would be remembered not as a villain, but as a symbol of the wild and unpredictable nature of Alaska's wilderness. Its death would serve as a reminder that in Alaska, humans remained visitors in a landscape dominated by forces beyond their control, and that coexistence with wildlife required constant vigilance, respect, and understanding. The bear's story would become part of Alaska's collective memory, a reminder of both the beauty and the danger of life in one of the world's last great wilderness areas. The Kenai River would continue to flow through Alaska's wilderness, carrying salmon upstream to spawn and providing habitat for countless generations of bears, eagles, and other wildlife. The events of August 10th would become part of the river's history, but they would not define it. The river would remain a place of beauty and adventure, where humans could experience the wonder of Alaska's wilderness while being reminded of their place in the larger web of life that defined the last frontier. As the years passed, the specific details of the bear incident would fade from public memory, but its lessons would endure. The importance of wildlife conservation, the need for safety in bear country, and the complex challenges of managing human-wildlife conflicts in Alaska would remain relevant long after the immediate crisis had passed. The bear that died on the Kenai River on August 10th, 2024, would ultimately contribute to a better understanding of these challenges and to improve protections for both humans and wildlife in Alaska's wilderness areas. The story of Jonas Burke and the brown bear would become part of Alaska's folklore, told and retold in fishing lodges and around campfires throughout the state. Each telling would emphasize different aspects of the story: the importance of following fishing regulations, the unpredictability of wildlife encounters, the courage required of law enforcement officers, or the delicate balance between conservation and recreation. But all versions of the story would serve as a reminder that in Alaska, adventure and danger were never far apart, and that respect for the wilderness and its inhabitants was essential for all who chose to venture into the last frontier. The legacy of August 10, 2024, would ultimately be measured not in the death of a single bear or the heroism of one law enforcement officer, but in the lessons learned and the improvements made to protect both humans and wildlife in Alaska's wilderness. The incident would serve as a catalyst for positive change, leading to better safety protocols, enhanced training programs, and improved understanding of the complex factors that influence human-wildlife interactions in one of the world's most spectacular wilderness areas.